Opening credits. Gakko Came from Venus, exploring the lost history of Eckankar. Written by David Christopher Lane. Narrated by F.C. LaPlante. A brief overview of Eckankar. Eckankar was founded by Paul Twitchell, 1909 to 1971, in California in the mid-1960s. Although the Hindi-Punjabi term Eckankar, literally one god/power, was most likely derived from Guru Nanak's Japji, the first set of hymns in the Sikh holy book Guru Granth Sahib, Twitchell altered its original phonetic spelling and definition, claiming that Eckankar was a Tibetan Pali word, meaning co-worker with God. According to Twitchell, Eckankar was an ancient spiritual path with a lineage of 970 Ek masters who traced back to Gakko, who brought the true teachings of soul travel from the city of Retz on the planet Venus. Twitchell alleged that through this bilocation philosophy, a neophyte can leave his or her body via an inner light and sound and soul travel to higher regions of consciousness, which lead ultimately to the Supreme Lord, Sugmad. The living Ek-master, occasionally retaining the more exalted title of Mahanta, the highest state of God consciousness on earth, is central to Eckankar's theology because it is through his guidance that the student, known as a chela, receives various levels of initiation, usually involving instructions into new sacred tones and other higher-level practices of contemplation. In an early article entitled The Cliffhanger, published in Psychic Observer in 1964, Twitchell explained the basis behind his new group. Eckankar, which I formed out of my own experience, is the term used for the philosophy I have developed for the Cliffhanger. It is based on Shabad Yoga, a way-out form of yoga. The word is the Hindu locution for the cosmic sound current, which is known in our vernacular as the cosmic river of God. Twitchell attributed the evolution of his personal philosophy into a public spiritual path to his second wife, Gail Atkinson, whom he married in 1964 when he was 54 years old and she was 21, saying, "The switchover from the Cliffhanger to Ek began taking place after I met my present wife, Gail. She insisted that I do something with my knowledge and abilities." Quoted in Brad Steiger, In My Soul I Am Free, San Diego, 1974, page 64. Eckankar's organization and teachings have evolved since Twitchell died of heart disease on September 17, 1971, in Cincinnati, Ohio, shortly after giving a talk. Twitchell's widow, Gail Atkinson, his first wife, Camille Ballo, whom he married in 1942, divorced him on the legal grounds of desertion in 1960. Claimed to have had a dream in which her husband appointed Darwin Gross to be his spiritual successor and the leader of Eckankar. Gross, who eventually married and then divorced Atkinson, served as the living Eckmaster for 10 years, until 1981, when he appointed Harold Klemp to succeed him as the spiritual leader of the organization. 2 years later, in 1983, there was an acrimonious split between Klemp and Gross, which resulted in the latter being excommunicated from Eckankar. A lawsuit was filed by the Eckankar organization against Gross for allegedly misappropriating funds and for trademark and copyright infringement. Gross subsequently cut off any formal ties with Eckankar and started his own group called ATOM, the Ancient Teachings of the Masters. Eckankar has more or less erased Gross's tenure and books from their official histories. After selling the copyrights of Twitchell's books to Eckankar, Gail Atkinson ended her association with Eckankar. Under the present leadership of Klemp, Eckankar has expanded its core audience worldwide and has an estimated paid membership of anywhere between 40,000 and 100,000 members yearly. Eckankar does not provide exact numbers. Klemp has also produced a wide-ranging series of books and discourses and has moved Eckankar's former center of operations from Menlo Park, California, to Chanhassen, Minnesota, where he established the Temple of Ek. According to its own accounting, Eckankar has members from over 100 countries around the world. During Klem's tenure, Eckankar has also systematized its teachings and made it more accessible to the general reading public by lessening its emphasis on Twitchell's extensive use of Indian-influenced terminology, particularly Hindi and Punjabi. Eckankar's official website, http://www.eckan-kar.org, presents a codified version of its belief system. Soul is eternal and is the individual's true identity. Soul exists because God loves it. Soul is on a journey of self and God realization. Spiritual unfoldment can be accelerated through conscious contact with the Ek, divine spirit. This contact can be made via the spiritual exercises of Ek and the guidance of the living Ek Master. The Mahanta, the living Ek Master, is the spiritual leader of Eckankar. Spiritual experience and liberation in this lifetime are available to all. You can actively explore the spiritual worlds through soul travel, dreams, and other spiritual techniques. Eckankar has weathered a fair storm of controversy since its inception, primarily because of questions concerning Twitchell's alleged plagiarism, biographical redactions, and purported historical antecedents. First, Twitchell claimed that while traveling in Europe and India, he was taught Eckankar by the two former masters who preceded him, Sudar Singh of Allahabad and Rebazar Tars, a supposed 500-year-old Tibetan monk. However, there is no documented evidence proving that Twitchell had visited these countries when he claimed he did, or that either Sudar Singh or Rebazar Tars are genuine historical figures. Rather, there is ample evidence, even from Twitchell's own pen, that he was associated with Swami Premananda of the Self-Revelation Church of Absolute Monism in Washington, D.C., from 1950 to 1955, when he was asked to leave the church compound for personal misconduct. Additionally, Twitchell received initiation into Shabad Yoga in 1955 from Kirpal Singh, the founder of Ruhani Satsang in Delhi, India, while the Guru was on his first tour of the United States. He kept in close contact with Kirpal Singh via correspondence for at least a decade, and took his wife Gail to see the Indian Guru and have her receive initiation from him in San Francisco in 1963. Twitchell also joined L. Ron Hubbard's Church of Scientology in the 1950s, and eventually served for a short time as his press agent and wrote a number of articles for the group. With the founding of Eckankar, however, Twitchell altered his biography and redacted references to his former teachers and replaced them with a hierarchy of Ek Masters. He even changed his birth date, claiming on his second marriage certificate that he was born in 1922, subtracting some 13 years off his age. He also eventually denied his initiation under Kirpal Singh and threatened to sue his former guru over what he considered defamatory claims concerning his discipleship. A number of Twitchell's books on Eckankar contain large chunks of material appropriated from sources he failed to reference. Twitchell seemed particularly fond of plagiarizing whole passages from Radhaswami Satsang Bay's author Julian Johnson, whose two books, With a Great Master in India, 1934, and The Path of the Master, 1939, contributed to much of Eckankar's specialized terminology that draws extensively from the Sant Mant tradition of North India, an eclectic spiritual movement that includes such poet-saints as Kabir, Dadu, and Tulsi Sahib. While Gross denied such appropriations for over a decade, the current Ek leader, Harold Klemp, has acknowledged some of Twitchell's plagiarisms by calling him a master compiler. Regardless of these continuing controversies, Eckankar has become an exceptionally successful religion, with centers spanning the globe. Interestingly, Eckankar has a strong presence in Africa, particularly Nigeria, and in Europe, and it continues to draw thousands to its yearly conferences. While Eckankar has been directly influenced by the Self-Realization Fellowship, Theosophy, Scientology, and particularly Sant Mant, Via its specialized versions of sound current yoga, it has, in turn, influenced a number of new religious offshoots, including the movement of spiritual inner awareness, MSIA, or Messiah, founded by John Rogers Hinkins, Master Path, founded by Gary Olson, the Ancient Teachings of the Masters, Adam, founded by Darwin Gross, the Divine Science of Light and Sound, founded by Jerry Mulvin, the Sonic Spectrum, founded by Michael Turner, and the Higher Consciousness Society, founded by Ford Johnson. Each of the founders of these groups was at one time a member of Eckankar, and they have all incorporated many Eck terms and ideas into their respective organizations. Eckankar's future looks bright as it enters its 5th decade of existence. Bibliography: Johnson, Ford, Confessions of a God Seeker, A Journey to Higher Consciousness, Silver Springs, Maryland, 2003. Klemp, Harold, Autobiography of a Modern Prophet, Minneapolis, 2000. Lane, David Christopher, The Making of a Spiritual Movement, The Untold Story of Paul Twitchell and Eckankar, Del Mar, California, 1983. Marmon, Doug, Dialogue in the Age of Criticism. Twitchell, Paul, Eckankar, The Key to Secret Worlds, San Diego, 1969. Exposing Cults, an Interview. Question 1. Has there been any retaliation against you since writing your books? Yes. When I was just 20 years old, I wrote a long term paper for a religious studies class at CSUN on Eckankar, and I naively sent it to their international headquarters that was then in Menlo Park, California. Several weeks later, I received a registered letter from Eckankar's attorney in San Francisco threatening me with a lawsuit if I published my 100 pages plus paper. This clearly got the ball rolling, and I decided there and then to do more research on the group, which resulted in me taking a 6-unit independent course at CSUN during my senior year, 1978, where I ended up writing the now somewhat infamous book, The Making of a Spiritual Movement, The Untold Story of Paul Twitchell and Eckankar. Around this same time, the Spiritual Counterfeits Project in Berkeley was working on their own magazine devoted to exposing Eckankar as a fraud. Their researchers flew down and interviewed me in Los Angeles, and they asked if they could use my term paper as the basis for their study. I agreed, even though I didn't share their particular religious outlook. They then published a magazine showing the hidden history of Eckankar, largely drawn from my research. Something like 40,000 copies were printed and then distributed worldwide, reaching every Eckankar center in North America, Europe, Africa, and elsewhere. This caused a major controversy, and the then spiritual leader of Eckankar, Sri Darwin Gross, sent out a global memo stating that my term paper and SCP's magazine should be destroyed on sight. A disgruntled Eckankar member working at a Kinko-style copy center in Oregon got a hold of my paper and then made numerable copies and sent them around the United States and Europe. A large group of Eckists, the popular name given to those who follow Eckankar, read my term paper and left the group. I also started receiving lots of mail. Most were appreciative, but some were angry. A few letters included death threats. Since Eckankar realized that they couldn't sue me, since I had heavily documented my findings, they decided instead to sue my classmate Jim Peebles, who, ironically enough, was himself an Eckist at the time. Eckankar, using a high-placed member as a decoy, Mike No, secured a copy of Peebles's paper under the false pretext that they were part of the Spiritual Counterfeits Project. For making one Xerox copy of Peebles' paper, Professor Ed Gruss, James Peebles, and Los Angeles Baptist College were sued for millions plus dollars for allegedly publishing, one copy mind you, a defamatory term paper. Eckankar then proceeded to take out large advertisements in various newspapers on the West Coast claiming that they were being unfairly attacked, neglecting to mention that they were the ones who actually generated the controversy and actually sued one of their own members. Eventually, Eckankar hired a business consultant, Bill Popham, to study the impact of my term paper, later turned book, on their membership. Shortly thereafter, Darwin Gross resigned and gave over his leadership to the present living Eck master, Sri Harold Klemp. Eckankar has over the years continued to harass me and has threatened more lawsuits over the years, and one of them, over the cover of the 1983 edition, was settled out of court. That particular copy, because of its rarity, by the way, was once selling on abebooks.com for over $2,000. However, Eckankar didn't attack me as severely as some other groups. For example, John Roger Hinkins, the founder of Messiah, and most notably the spiritual guru of Arianna Huffington, not only personally robbed my house, but proceeded to create a phony front organization called the Coalition for Civil and Spiritual Freedom near his privately owned school, the University of Santa Monica, which sent out death threats against me and those who helped me in my research. This happened because I wrote an article on John Roger exposing his hidden life and work. It was entitled The J.R. Controversy, and much of that research was later incorporated in Peter McWilliams's well-known book, Life 102, What to Do When Your Guru Sues You. In that book, McWilliams provides vivid details about the robbery of my home and the death threats made against my life. Here is a pertinent excerpt. John Roger as Thief. Excerpt from Life 102 by Peter McWilliams. In 1983, several of the people who left Messiah, one John Rogers' personal secretary, another a member of John Rogers' live-in personal staff, were tired of the intimidation, threats, and harassment, and also felt that the hidden story about John Rogers' evil empire needed to be told. They contacted Professor David Lane, Ph.D., who had written a book, The Making of a Spiritual Movement, which conclusively proved that the teachings of Eckankar came from the Radhaswami tradition of India. The book rocked the Eckankar organization to its very foundation, or, if you prefer, rocked the Eckankar Foundation to its very organization. Dr. Lane had also met with John Roger on several occasions, and they were on friendly terms. To the former staff members, Dr. Lane seemed to be the ideal choice to investigate and report on what had been carefully hidden within John Rogers' organizations. He was an academician with a commitment to truth and a knowledge of spiritual practices. He himself follows a spiritual path that would allow him to distinguish between legitimate spiritual teachings and the illegitimate, sometimes outrageous, justifications in the name of God given by John Roger. Dr. Lane's casual but cordial relationship with John Roger would eliminate any basis for the charge that Dr. Lane had intentionally set out to do a hatchet job. After doing some preliminary research, Dr. Lane found that, although he was certainly shocked by what he discovered, he was somehow not inclined to complete the project. Dr. Lane was on the verge of abandoning his article when John Roger, who shoots himself in the foot so often he should wear stainless steel socks, began harassing Dr. Lane. Wrong move. Dr. Lane, as he had proven when he took on the entire Eckankar organization, far larger than Messiah, did not succumb to intimidation. The fact that John Roger was so eager to keep Dr. Lane from exploring any further indicated that there was good exploration ahead. In mid-1984, he published The J.R. Controversy, a critical analysis of John Roger Hinkins and the MSIA. This article, published in Dr. Lane's research series, Understanding Cults and Spiritual Movements, was a breakthrough work on exposing the dark side of John Rogers' farce. The article revealed and documented for the first time John Rogers' plagiarism, intimidation, violence, and sexual exploits. John Rogers' response? A general denial of the facts and a general attack on Dr. Lane. On October 5, 1984, having driven to Del Mar, California, in John Rogers' baby blue Lincoln Continental, John Roger and Michael Fetter broke into Dr. Lane's apartment in Del Mar, California. John Roger is placed at the scene of the crime because of 2 words he wrote on a box containing copies of the J.R. controversy. The words were, "No more." Handwriting experts had verified that this was written in John Roger's hand, and it fits John Roger's pattern of not being able to resist having the last word or to add a didactic comment to every situation. By writing "No more" on a box containing the J.R. controversy, he did both. Michael Fetter was placed in the apartment because the bed was turned completely over, a physical feat John Roger would have been incapable of doing alone. Only John Roger and Michael Fetter made the trip. They told the other staff members they were going to San Diego. It is possible that John Roger left Michael Fetter behind and picked up another henchman in Del Mar. But, considering Michael Fetter's ongoing shady doings with John Roger, Fetter is the most likely suspect. In addition to the beds being turned over, the entire apartment was ransacked, to make absolutely certain that Dr. Lane would not think common garden-variety thieves had broken in. The television, stereo, and other valuables were not taken. What was taken was Dr. Lane's years of research on spiritual groups and cults, the files on Messiah and Eckankar in particular. Also taken were 2 personal diaries written by Dr. Lane's wife, the list of subscribers for Dr. Lane's research series Understanding Cults and Spiritual Movements, Dr. Lane's briefcase containing uncorrected term papers, to the chagrin of my college students, notes Dr. Lane, and a card file containing a lifetime of Dr. Lane's collected recipes. The latter was a heavy blow for me, remembers Dr. Lane. The robbers probably thought it contained secret inside information and thus was done in code. It was not immediately clear who took the materials. It could have been someone from Messiah, or it could have been someone from Eckankar, from one of the other cults Dr. Lane was researching, or someone who gets off on reading the diaries of college professors' wives. The police, with so many possible culprits, were unable to act. Over the next year, which we shall explore next, as the information implicating John Roger gradually appeared, the handwriting analysis of "No more" confirmed John Roger's physical participation in the robbery. Eventually, due to a series of unfortunate events concerning Peter McWilliams' personal life, he was dying from AIDS and was being sued repeatedly by J.R. over his book Life 102. John Roger and Messiah sued me and the case went to court. Later, Messiah brokered a deal with me where they agreed not to harass me anymore. You would think that would have been enough. But then I got tremendous heat for my research work on Sathya Sai Baba, one of the most famous gurus in Indian history. This led to all sorts of death threats. I remember getting a death threat a day for nearly 6 months on my answering machine at Mount San Antonio College. With the untimely death of Sai Baba, the threat stopped. I could go on, but this gives you a taste of what I have gone through these past few decades. Exposing cults. Continued. Question 2. What is your theory as to why a person would get involved in a cult? This is a more difficult question to answer than most people realize. Indeed, depending on how one defines cult, we could say that we are all members of some cult, whether it be surfing, school, church, a rap band, etc. I think the number one reason that motivates individuals to seek out cults or religions is the human desire for meaning or purpose in one's life. In this regard, I have developed a simple theory called meaning equivalence, which basically states that any meaning system is sufficient provided that one can believe in it. If this is true, and I think it is, then there should be literally thousands of religions satisfying people's insatiable desire for some kind of order or purpose in their lives. And if you look around, that is precisely what we find, from Scientology to Mormonism to the flying spaghetti monster. In other words, any meaning is better than no meaning, provided that such meaning makes us, from an evolutionary perspective, want to live an extra day. Question 3. Can you describe a classic cult personality? Well, I don't know if there is any perfectly archetypal cult personality, but the most exaggerated version of it is this: the desire to have someone else live your life so that you don't have to think through all the hard and tough decisions one must make as a mature adult. You want someone else to do your thinking for you, and therefore tend to project onto some holy figure or scripture as an unquestioned authority. I find fundamentalism, of any persuasion, to be a mental disease. The sad thing is that there are far too many people suffering from it as I write these words. It is an epidemic and has probably been with us in some form from time immemorial. If you read the fantastic exposé of Scientology by Lawrence Wright called Going Clear, you will get a glimpse of how sickened this type of thinking, or not thinking, can be. Question 4. Is there any one cult that has fascinated you the most? Great question. Right off the top of my head, I must say that DeFree John and his Dawn Horse community was probably the most intriguing for a variety of reasons. DeFree John, otherwise known as Franklin Jones, was born in Jamaica, New York, in 1939, but went on to found one of the most nefarious New Age cults of the 1970s. At one time he had 9 or so wives, apparently had an addiction to a whole host of narcotics, and lived on an obscure island in Fiji, formerly owned by television star Raymond Burr, and was surrounded by tens of extremely devoted disciples. DeFree John was intriguing because he was exceptionally bright and had a deeply insightful mind, yet at the same time was an extreme narcissist who literally believed he was the greatest God-man of all time. Professor Scott Lowe, Ph.D. from the University of Wisconsin, and I wrote a book on him back in the 1990s called D.A., The Strange Case of Franklin Jones. Question 5. How did a philosophy teacher get into writing about cults? It started, as I mentioned earlier, when I got threatened with a lawsuit from writing a term paper when I was just 20 years old. That is what got the ball rolling. Yet it was really never my intention to expose cults or gurus or anything of the sort. It just turns out to be the case that far too many religions and their respective leaders are not forthcoming or honest about their history or teachings. Question 6. Would you agree that a group of high school students could be considered a cult? For example, could the tight-knit community of my swim team be a cult? Yes. The word cult is etymologically derived from both the French and the Latin and generally means worship or devotion around a central idea, object, or person. Given this definition, one could imagine almost anything being cultic, from cliques in high school, to cliques in surfing, to cliques in music. I sometimes make a joke about the word culture and say if you take the "ure" out, you end up with the word cult. The danger is that it is far too easy to point the finger at other cults and not recognize that we ourselves may be members of one as well. Question 7. Do you use personal experience in your writing? Yes, I find that the best writing is when we draw upon our own experiences. Question 8. What influenced you to write a book about cults? I have always been somewhat of a skeptic from an early age. Being brought up Catholic and having attended their schools for nearly 12 years, I saw how closed-minded religious thinking could be. I even got kicked out of high school for questioning certain religious dogmas. I think it is vitally important to think for oneself and not be swayed by the herd mind. Question 9. How do you come up with your book titles? I love coming up with creative titles, but the key is to be accurate to your subject so that the potential reader is not misled. I generally try to think of titles that capture the subject matter, but also provide a slight twist. My favorite title, which formed the basis of a magazine article I wrote, is In Search of the Perfect Coke, which, contrary to what you might at first suspect, is actually about finding the perfect bottle of Coca-Cola. It is more of a philosophical journey and less about sugary carbonation. Question 10. Am I the first person to coin the term cultification and cultinator? I did a quick Google search, and I am sorry to report that both words have been used before, though I do like them, and I think I may use them in the future. Do I owe you a royalty fee? Thanks for the interview. The Fate magazine debates. A Natural Way. In the June 1982 issue of Fate, an article entitled World's Oldest Astrological Record by David Christopher Lane contains some misinformation about the teachings of Eckankar. The author wrote, "It is of interest that the Radhaswami movement has been the basis for several popular religious groups in America, including Eckankar. I would like to clarify the origin of Eckankar and the Eckmasters. Eckankar, as a way of life, is a natural way back to God. It embraces the purest of teachings dating back to the beginning of time. Traces of this spiritual teaching can be found as far back as the Nakal records. Eckankar, Ek, and Ek appear in the temple carvings of Greece, the Sanskrit scriptures of India, and the Pali texts of Tibet and China. The Eckmasters of the Vairagi order, also traceable throughout history, have always been present on this planet to serve as way showers for those wishing to obtain self-realization. Sri Paul Twitchell was the 971st living Eckmaster and brought these ancient teachings to light in the modern world through his numerous manuscripts on Eckankar. Nowhere in the Eck teachings is there a denial of the validity of other paths or teachings. Eckankar is available for those who freely choose to follow its principles. It offers spiritual techniques for proving to oneself that there is survival after death, and that one may experience the heavenly worlds during this lifetime. It provides a method for the individual to demonstrate by his own volition total awareness, the awareness of God. Joanne E. Spall, Menlo Park, California. Eckankar objection overruled. I object to Joanne E. Spall's letter, Reports from the Readers, September 1982 Fate, in which she claims that my article, World's Oldest Astrological Record, June 1982, contains misinformation about the teachings and origins of Eckankar. Let me illustrate why Eckankar is mostly derived from the Radhaswami tradition of India. 1. Paul Twitchell was initiated in 1955 by Kirpal Singh, a close disciple of Sawant Singh of Radhaswami Satsang base, but later tried to cover up his association with the Guru by deleting the name Kirpal Singh from his articles and books and replacing it with the fictitious name Sudar Singh. 2. Parts of Paul Twitchell's writings are adapted from Radhaswami-based publications. Twitchell's The Far Country, 1966, is almost entirely copied from Julian P. Johnson's two books, The Path of the Masters in India, 1933, and The Path of the Masters, 1939. This constitutes a serious infringement of copyright laws. 3. The word Eckankar does not appear in the temple carvings of Greece or priestly scrolls of Egypt, as Joanne E. Spall claims. Eckankar, spelled usually Ek-Onkar, was a word used exclusively by the Sikh gurus to describe the one Ek, true God, Onkar, in their holy writings, the Guru Granth Sahib. Ek-Onkar is the very name for God in Guru Nanak's Japji, 16th century, which was translated by Kirpal Singh. Twitchell learned of the word and its usage through his association with Ruhani Satsang, founded by the late Kirpal Singh of Gurmandi, Delhi, India. 4. The teachings of Eckankar are primarily derived from four distinct spiritual movements: Ruhani Satsang, Self-Realization Fellowship, Scientology, and Theosophy. Twitchell at one time was a follower of Kirpal Singh, L. Ron Hubbard, and Swami Premananda. 5. Twitchell has stated in at least 2 places, see Letters to Gale, Volume 2, that he considers the Sarbachan to be his Bible. The book was written by the founder of Radhaswami, Shiv Dayal Singh, otherwise known as Swamiji Maharaj. 6. Spall's claim that the Ek masters of the Vairagi order are traceable throughout history is patently untrue. Even Paul Twitchell's immediate predecessor, Sudar Singh, is a fictional character whose life story is factual, only to the extent that it is based on the biographies of some real gurus, Kirpal Singh and Jaimal Singh. Twitchell literally made up names such as Phoebe Quants, Rebazar Tars, and Jagat Ho. None of these can be found in history. They are the products of Twitchell's vivid imagination. 7. Finally, Spall is incorrect when she writes that nowhere in the Ek movement is there denial of the validity of other paths or teachings. To quote the founder of Eckankar himself, Ek is the highest of all paths to God. There is no other way to gain spiritual enlightenment. All other paths are only stepping stones into the astral plane. Twitchell, in fact, goes to great lengths to show that no path, movement, or religion is valid in light of Eckankar. I suggest that anyone interested in the real biography of Paul Twitchell read any of the following works: The Making of a Spiritual Movement, The Untold Story of Twitchell and Eckankar by David Christopher Lane, Berkeley, B. William Walsh, 1979. SCP Journal, Eckankar, A Hard Look at a New Religion, Berkeley, 1979, or several recent encyclopedias of religion. For instance, Professor Mark Juergensmeyer's article on religion in the New Encyclopedia Britannica. Eckankar surely has the right to its own existence. But when thousands of people are being given a distorted view of history, plagiarized texts, and cover-ups, I think researchers and scholars also have the right to inform an unsuspecting public. David Christopher Lane, San Diego, California. Missing the point. David Lane has gone to great lengths to ridicule Eckankar. Reports from the Readers, February 1983 Fate. Although he writes as if he is knowledgeable about Eckankar's teachings, his letter clearly shows that he has missed the whole point. First, in one paragraph, Lane claims that Paul Twitchell, living Eckmaster from 1965 to 1971, stole all of the Eck teachings from other groups. Yet in the next paragraph, he is supposed to have made it all up. Twitchell did neither of these. He simply traced out the influence of spiritual history down through history to the present. He showed that truth or spirit or Eck, whatever you wish to call it, has not been evenly distributed throughout mankind, but has been fostered by the few individuals who consciously and continuously brought it forth for the people of their time. Some were ridiculed, some were attacked, and many never were publicly known because they taught only the few who showed a true desire to gain the experience of God. No master who has reached the spiritual world would care 2 cents about which book says what, which organization did what first of what the world may say. A master cares only about the spiritual force which can be heard by the inner ear and seen as light by spiritual vision. Twitchell has studied not only Theosophy, Radhaswami, and Scientology, as Lane points out, but also Kabbalism, Sufism, Taoism, all forms of Buddhism and Hinduism, the mystical orders of the Church, Mohammedanism, Jainism, Christian Science, the Mormon religion, and modern-day New Thought. He studied just about every form of religion known to man in his attempt to show that the Ek flows freely across the borders to all races and creeds, and yet slowly withdraws when man attempts to codify, control, or contain it. No organization in this world can contain all of Ek. It is universal. No one can claim sole rights. No one can say he wrote it first and everyone else is a copycat. Doug Marmon, Los Altos, California. David Lane's research on the background of Eckankar may or may not be accurate, but he completely misses the point. The principles of Eckankar, when properly applied, cause transformation within the individual, and each change brings great relief as obstacles fall away and personal capability and understanding increase. As an Eckist for 7 years, I don't care if Paul Twitchell got it out of a can. It works. He is respected as one who undertook the nearly impossible task of translating and correlating Eastern, in truth universal, principles for the Western mind and way of life. Lane seems to think that Twitchell's involvement with numerous other spiritual paths casts doubt on his authenticity. To my mind, it is only proof that he is no upstart, but an individual well-grounded in spiritual knowledge. Twitchell's uniqueness stems from the fact that his efforts in spiritual areas transformed him into one who did indeed rise to the higher realities which have always existed. This is the reason that Eckankar can truthfully claim to be the most ancient teaching known to man. It deals with what always was and always will be. And it was Paul Twitchell who made the breakthrough to reach the general public with the principles of this transformation into higher awareness. It was he, not any who preceded him, who made the techniques available to all who desire the same knowledge. From my own lengthy spiritual odyssey, I can affirm that no other path offers the simple ways to experience these astonishing other realities while allowing one to keep in balance in an involved and responsible daily existence with family, work, and leisure. As for Rebizar Tars and the other masters having been made up, my own happy encounter with Rebizar, before I even knew of him through Eckankar, is validation enough for me. Lane's motive for his negativity in this respect must be his own regrettable lack of experience. I recall my own anger when my years of research into world religions revealed that all of Christianity existed long before Christ. Communion from the pagan ceremonies of Bacchus, the Trinity from Egypt, and savior gods including baptism, virgin birth, the cross, the resurrection, all were common to numerous ancient cultures. Even the Sermon on the Mount was recorded in the Book of Enoch, at least 100 years before Christ, as the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal. Are these plagiarisms good cause to attack and expose Christianity? Perhaps it is best to allow people to discover spiritual truth for themselves, not to attempt to intimidate them with negative attacks on their chosen path. Constance Robertson, Peoria, Illinois. A final word. Constance Robertson's letter, Report from the Readers, May 1983 Fate, is not so much a critical assessment of my research work on Eckankar, since it contains no contradictory evidence, as it is a testimony to her own faith in the validity of Eck teachings. I have no argument with her beliefs, but I do object to her several inaccurate allegations concerning my investigations of Eckankar. 1. Robertson is incorrect when she claims that I believe Twitchell's involvement with numerous spiritual paths exposes his authenticity. Rather, it was Twitchell's denial of his spiritual roots that caused me to question his genuineness. To put it simply, does a true master make false claims about his past, such as claiming to be born in 1922, when in fact his birth date is 1908, hold out other authors' ideas as his own, and commence international cover-ups? I would think not. But that is precisely what Twitchell did from 1966 until his sudden death in 1971. 2. Who is Rebizar Tars? Even Paul Twitchell does not seem to know for sure, although he is the one who made him up. At one point in his career, Twitchell refers to Kirpal Singh, the founder of Ruhani Satsang, as the master who helped him have out-of-body experiences, and who used to visit him nightly in Washington, D.C., and dictate the book, The Tiger's Fang. But later on, with the growth of Eckankar and the influx of money, he switches names, not the story, and claims that it was Rebizar Tars who visited and helped produce the now famous book. What we have here in reality is not one individual, but a composite of gurus. This Rebazar represents not just a 500-year-old Tibetan monk, but also Kirpal Singh, Swami Premananda, Sawan Singh, Kabir, and even Jesus Christ. Robertson's spiritual encounters with Rebazar are really better understood as meetings with her higher self, which manifests according to her own religious upbringing. 3. The reason that Eckankar works may have nothing to do with the organization itself. It might be due to Robertson's own self. Since every human being has an inherent structural potential for higher levels of experience, we can see this exemplified, for instance, in the universality of near-death experiences. In any case, almost all of Eckankar's techniques are derived from pre-existing spiritual teachings, including Kriya Yoga, Shabad Yoga, and other esoteric disciplines. 4. Instead of giving a documented rebuttal to my findings on Eckankar, Robertson resorts to superfluous innuendos about my spiritual progress, all of which has nothing to do with the subject at hand. My research is not a contest of personalities, but rather a tool for deeper and better understanding. As I have stated before, I have nothing against Eckankar or the late Paul Twitchell. I just happen to believe in good historical scholarship. David Christopher Lane, San Diego, California. A contradiction. Over the years, I have studied many spiritual subjects. I have been involved in Kundalini Yoga, Surat Yoga, and Eckankar, the science of soul travel. Thus, I found David Christopher Lane's article, Speaking in Tongues, July 1986 Fate, interesting in that he describes a personal experience which we are supposed to accept as true. Yet, in his book, The Making of a Spiritual Movement, which deals with Eckankar, its founder Paul Twitchell, and its relationship to Surat Shabad Yoga and its master Kirpal Singh, Lane brands as fantasy all the thousands of experiences Eckas have had over the years. All this is confusing. Is Lane after the truth? There seems to be a contradiction. Bob Van Wagenen, Auburn, New York. Although I understand Bob Van Wagenen's confusion, the fact is that I have never dismissed the experiences of Eckankar's followers as fantasy. Rather, in my book, The Making of a Spiritual Movement, The Untold History of Paul Twitchell and Eckankar, I documented how the founder of Eckankar lied about his biography, covered up his association with Indian gurus, for example, Kirpal Singh and Swami Premananda, plagiarized extensively from Radhaswami Bay's texts, particularly Julian P. Johnson's The Path of the Masters, 1939, and created fictional Vairagi masters to buttress his false historical claims. Masters such as Rebazar, Fubbi Quants, Sudar Singh, and Yabi Sakabi are not real persons, but products of Paul Twitchell's creative imagination. Hence, on page 96 of my book, I argued that an Eckankar member may indeed achieve a higher state of consciousness and behold a vision of what he or she believes to be Rebazar. But it is not the Tibetan monk, or Eckankar for that matter, who is bestowing the elevated experience. It is the devotee's own inherent capability for advanced structural adaptation, manifested, for example, in near-death experiences, which allows for such mystical heights. Therefore, anybody in any religion, legitimate or illegitimate, can have authentic spiritual experiences. The confusion arises when we mistakenly believe that Eckankar is the power behind the numinous encounters. No, Eckankar is only the cultural superstructure which flavors and names the archetypal astral experience. For instance, we know from studies of near-death experiences that people all over the world, regardless of background, have had out-of-body experiences and have seen wondrous beings of light. Because of a person's particular religious upbringing, however, he or she may call the inner light Jesus or Allah or even God. The names are cultural. The experience itself is universal. The important question concerning the authenticity of religious visions is not one of content. It matters little if one beholds the Virgin Mary, Buddha, or the local minister, but of context. That is, on which level of consciousness is the vision seen? Is it a subconscious dream image, a psychic intuition, or a genuine encounter with an astral plane deity? Only after such a contextual, structural determination can the critical phenomenologist proceed to analyze the content of the vision properly and assess its degree of legitimacy. Since Eckankar is primarily based upon Surat Shabad Yoga, union of the soul with the divine inner sound, which Twitchell learned from Kirpal Singh, it is not surprising that certain Ekkas have extraordinary experiences. There is no question that Surat Shabad Yoga is an experientially viable discipline for interested spiritual seekers. Indeed, in the latest issue of Understanding Cults, I have illustrated how Shabad Yoga offers a scientific methodology for exploring inner regions of light and sound, practically testable for anyone willing to engage in the prescribed practices. But the problem with Eckankar is that it is an illegitimate offshoot of more authentic Shabad Yoga groups. In India, Shabad Yoga is taught at no cost by genuine saints. In America, it is taught by misinformed teachers for monetary profit. David Christopher Lane, Del Mar, California. The Lane-Marmon Conversation. I first wrote about Paul Twitchell and Eckankar in a term paper for an upper division class in religious studies at California State University, Northridge, in 1977. I don't think I could have imagined then that I would still find the subject intriguing 33 years later. Yet, I have found over the decades that the life and work of Paul Twitchell, the founder of Eckankar in the 1960s, continues to fascinate. There are many reasons for this, but I think primarily it is because Twitchell himself is open to so many varied interpretations. Doug Marmon and I first exchanged our differing views back in the early 1980s in a letter exchange in Fate magazine, which was prompted by a passing reference I made about Paul Twitchell and Eckankar in an article I wrote for Fate magazine in 1982 about the Bhrigu Samhita, which is alleged by some to be the world's oldest astrological book. We resumed our exchanges more directly on the alt.religion news group on the Internet in the mid and latter part of the 1990s. By the turn of the millennium, Doug began a systematic appraisal of my second term paper, later book, The Making of a Spiritual Movement, which I wrote for an independent study course during my senior year at CSUN. Eventually, Doug Marmon revised his net offerings and published them in a finely produced book entitled The Whole Truth. Since that time, I have desired to respond point by point to many of Doug's findings and interpretations. I decided the best way for me to proceed is to do such in installments, starting with some initial rejoinders that I wrote when Doug started to publish his analysis in installments on the web. Now, I fully realize that Doug and I will most likely not see eye to eye on each and every issue, but I do think that our discussions have yielded more versus less information on the fascinating character of Paul Twitchell. Doug Marmon writes, David explores 3 subjects in Chapter 1 of his book: the birth date of Paul Twitchell, where he was born, and a few details concerning Paul's life up until about 1950. These might not seem like subjects worthy of a whole chapter, but Paul's life is far from easy to pin down. David has pieced together information from a delayed birth certificate, a marriage license, family Bibles, a death certificate, school records, quotes from relatives of Paul's brother and sister, and other records. Interestingly, the information from all of these sources is contradictory. The upshot of David's research is that Paul's family and friends reported differing birth dates at different times in his life. For example, Paul's death certificate in 1971 records a birth date of October 22, 1922. However, this would have made Paul only 10 years old when he entered college in September 1933. Paul's first marriage certificate to Camille Ballot, dated September 1942, shows a birth date of October 22, 1912. This is the same date that Paul's father recorded when he filed a delayed birth certificate for Paul 1 year earlier. Apparently, no official birth certificate had been recorded at the time of Paul's birth, but none of these records agree with dates recorded in the Twitchell family Bible, or through a family genealogy, which would place Paul's birth in 1909, 1910, or perhaps even 1908. David does a pretty good job of reporting these facts, except for a couple of instances where he simply couldn't contain himself, such as his comment, "These two documents do summarily indicate that the 1922 birth date was a fabrication made years later by Paul, presumably to convince his young wife Gail that he was not much older than herself." Why David insists on inserting his unsupported presumptions, I don't know, but it sure does cloud the facts. While the records David turned up clearly show the 1922 date to be untenable, David hasn't produced a single record showing that Paul himself was the cause behind any of these inaccurate dates. This fact isn't at all obvious in his book. Like most readers, when I first read David's chapter, I thought David had caught Paul lying about his birth date. I had assumed that David had something to back up such comments as, for some reason, Twitchell has led Steiger and others, including Gail Atkinson and Jack Jarvis, to believe that he was born in the early 1920s, specifically October 22, 1922, when in actuality he was born much earlier, 1908 to 1912. It was only after posting my first response to David's Chapter 1 on the Internet that Steve Runfeld wrote to say he could not find a single case where Paul had lied about his age or birth date. After all, he said, we can hardly accuse Paul of lying on his death certificate. That's when I looked more closely at the facts and discovered he was right. Suddenly, a different picture began to emerge. For example, Paul enlisted in the Navy shortly after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941. He wanted to support his country during that time of great unrest. It was apparently for this reason that Paul's father filed a belated birth certificate, since Paul needed it to enlist. Next year, when Paul married Camille Ballot, of course, this same certificate would have been used for his marriage license. But this 1912 date of birth that Paul's father recorded is also wrong, just as the 1922 date was wrong on Paul's death certificate. This would be odd enough if we didn't also learn that the Twitchell family Bible was also incorrect. Through our internet dialogues, David finally thought he had produced a document that had Paul dead to rights. He had tracked down the age Paul recorded upon entering college. But this turned out to be another misunderstanding, since the record was actually from the date of Paul's admittance to college, which easily explains the 1-year error. The college registrar even apologized for his mistake. One by one, the long list of examples that David offered up to prove that Paul had lied about his birth date disappeared. What looked like a strong case at first dwindled away to mere quotes from family members or friends who made the mistakes. In fact, the new image that has emerged is of a man who never spoke about his age or his year of birth, and also chose not to comment when others got it wrong. David argues that Paul was probably still the instigator behind many of these errors, since that is the simplest explanation. He calls this the principle of Occam's razor, which says that when facing many theories, the simplest and most obvious is usually the best. However, after watching all of the cases of Paul's youth resolve themselves with a more thorough investigation, I didn't find much use in trusting Occam's razor. The simplest answer is that we don't know. However, what we do know is that from the day Paul was born until the day he died, other people were recording his birth date wrong. It makes for a fascinating story, which only came to light after dialogue. Some of the confusion around Paul's real date of birth was cleared up when I made public for the first time a public record that reliably places Paul's birth in 1909. However, the question of whether his date of birth was October 23rd, as recorded in his family Bible, or October 22nd is still unknown. David Lane replies, "If I understand Doug's argument correctly here, it is basically that Paul may not be responsible for the changing birth dates in Paul Twitchell's life. Mistakes were made, as Doug pointed out, even when Paul was quite young by others who apparently were mistaken about Paul's actual birth date. While I certainly accept the fact that there are discrepancies about Paul's birth date, that is why I placed it between 1908 and 1912, given these conflicting records. I do indeed hold Paul Twitchell responsible for the 1922 birth date. Why? Here are my reasons. 1. Paul's widow Gail, who was the informant on his death certificate, lists his age as 48 and his birth date as October 22, 1922. 2. Jack Jarvis claims Paul Twitchell had turned 40 years old in a July 1963 article for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. 3. Brad Steiger, Paul Twitchell's biographer and author of In My Soul I Am Free, uses an approximate 1922 birth date as a timeline for a series of key events in Paul Twitchell's life. From these three sources, each of which are independent from each other, I surmise that Paul was the responsible agent. If Paul Twitchell's wife, biographer, and a key reporter all have the same birth date, then I don't think it's a stretch of incredulity to surmise that Paul himself was the source. Now, at the time that I wrote The Making of a Spiritual Movement, I did not have access to other records which would have substantiated this position of mine, based on the three sources mentioned above. Just recently, Ford Johnson posted on his website Paul Twitchell's marriage certificate with Gail Atkinson. On that marriage certificate, it also mentions Paul's birth date as being 1922. Do I, again, think Paul Twitchell was responsible for this? Yes. Do I think that these divergent lines of evidence point to Paul as the source? Yes. As for the line, made years later by Paul, presumably to convince his young wife Gail that he was not much older than herself, a line that Doug clearly objects to, let me explain. Even though I found a 1908 to 1912 range for Paul Twitchell's birth date in various records, and even if we grant that Paul may himself have started altering dates even on his first marriage certificate in the early 1940s and elsewhere, for whatever reasons, and that others may have been responsible agents as well, see his family records, I found that the 1922 birth date seems to have coincided with his meeting with Gail Atkinson. With all things being equal, in the realm of changing one's birth date, then why is Paul getting younger, a lot younger, some 13 years, when he meets a very young woman who was barely 20 herself? So I wrote, presumably, operative word here, to convince his young wife Gail that he was not much older than herself. Yes, we can debate my presumably, but that is precisely why I wrote presumably and not ontologically. To summarize again my position, yes, I think Paul is responsible for the 1922 birth date, given the key sources who use such a date, from his wife to his biographer. The key thing to either doubt my position or substantiate it. I think it would be interesting for someone to find out what Paul listed on his driver's license in California. If he lists, again, 1922, then that lends even more evidence that he is the responsible agent. Doug Marmon writes, David added one other strange comment in his section on Paul's date of birth. Furthermore, some Eckankar officials do not accept any of these dates. Instead, they propose that Paul Twitchell was really born as Pedar Zask before the Great Southern Earthquake of 1812. This is by far the most unusual account and subsequently the most difficult to prove concerning Twitchell's birthday and birthplace. The source of this story comes from Twitchell himself in one of his later books, The Spiritual Notebook, San Diego, Illuminated Way Press, 1971, wherein he writes on page 195, following him, Sudar Singh, is Pedar Zask, the spiritual name for Paul Twitchell, who was born on a packet boat in the midst of the Mississippi River, a few minutes after a great earthquake shook the Mid-South and formed a great lake in this region. There are a number of odd things about this comment. First, this quote from the Spiritual Notebook says nothing about 1812. Secondly, Paul clearly explains in the foreword to his book, The Drums of Eck, that the 1812 date refers to a prior lifetime. However, the most fascinating fact came to light on this subject from an internet visitor who joined the dialogue from Hamburg, Germany. After I had posted my evidence showing that Paul had actually been born in 1909, Volker Dorman posted a page from the U.S. Geological Survey's online database listing U.S. earthquakes over a 3.0 magnitude in the year 1909. One of the 13 earthquakes listed for 1909 occurred shortly after midnight on October 22nd. It was a 4.5 magnitude quake centered on the Mississippi River, about 30 miles from Paul's first home in Paducah, Kentucky. Once again, Mr. Occam would never have guessed the truth. David Lane replies, while I certainly agree with Doug that my comment is strange, it must be remembered that Eckankar, via Bill Popham, suggested that I didn't take the earlier 1812 date seriously, and that I should take into consideration that Paul may have been much older than we realized. At the time, I thought the critique in the office, it was tape-recorded by Eckankar, so perhaps one with access to their files can transcribe it to see precisely what Popham said in that meeting, was absurd. But I took Bill's suggestion and looked into it, hence that paragraph. Doug Marmon writes, The Stories of Paul's Youth. David also uncovered information that challenges two of Paul's stories about his childhood. First, that he was born out of wedlock and raised by a foster mother at the suggestion of his father. Second, that he first met Sudar Singh, an Ek master from Allahabad, India, while Paul was just a teenager visiting his half-sister K.D., who was studying art in Paris. As sources for his information, David refers to comments by K.D.'s husband, Paul Iverlet, since K.D. died in 1959, and Mattie Twitchell, the widow of Paul's older brother Clyde, since Clyde had already passed on as well. Both sources felt that these stories were nothing but fanciful yarns, as David puts it, developed over the years by Paul himself. David then thoughtfully includes this quote from Mattie's son. It's a good thing my daddy wasn't living. He would have beat the hell out of him, Paul, for telling lies about his early life. I really love that quote. I don't find these sources terribly convincing, since they were all twice removed from the actual events, and after first publishing my chapter, numerous other information came to light that shed even more doubt on Paul Iverlet's comments. For example, Iverlet assured David that Paul was actually born in 1908, which wasn't true. David Lane replies, While Iverlet may have been off by 1 year, given Doug's recent research, it must be remembered that Iverlet was responding to the allegation that Paul was either much older or much younger than he claimed. More precisely, Iverlet was responding to what he perceived as fictions in Steiger's book, In My Soul, I Am Free. While Doug doesn't find these family-related sources convincing, they do have one thing in common. They reject Paul's official biography. It is also interesting that some in Paul's related family perceive him as a liar, even if they themselves may not be completely accurate in recalling the details. Doug Marmon writes, Iverlet also called Paul's story about being born out of wedlock an atrocious lie, since Paul's father and mother were good Christian folks. Unfortunately, Iverlet was not aware of the records that indicate Effie was pregnant with her first child when she married Jacob Twitchell, and that Jacob had impregnated another woman while Effie was on her deathbed in 1940. Paul's story about his father's philandering was apparently true. How could Iverlet have been so in the dark on these matters? Well, it turns out that he was not Katie's first husband after all, as David had thought, and actually didn't marry K.D. until 1943, more than a year after Paul had left Paducah for good to join the Navy. Also, by the time David spoke on the phone with Iverlet in October 1977, David didn't realize that Iverlet was dying of cancer, and in fact passed away 1 month later. All this information came out later. According to Paul, he only learned the truth about his birth when his grandmother told him in private, after he had graduated high school and Katie had gone off to college. So, it is quite possible that other family members either didn't know the whole story or simply chose not to talk about it. This does offer one explanation why there was so much confusion over Paul's exact birth date in his family. David Lane replies, I think Doug has some good points here, and I think a more nuanced understanding of family sources is helpful. And I think Doug may be right on the matters about how families hide scandals or similar dark chapters in interpersonal relationships. Doug Marmon writes, On the other hand, Paul's story about meeting Sudar Singh as a teenager is fraught with troubles. Since Katie's birth records, according to the family Bible and her death certificate, indicate that she was born in 1904, and Paul's story indicated that their visit to Paris was interrupted by their mother's death, which took place in 1940, then K.D. would have been about 36 years old, and Paul himself would hardly have been a teenager either. Also, K.D.'s husband, Paul Iverlet, swears that not only did Katie never visit India or France, but in fact she had never even been outside the U.S. her whole life. Something about this story doesn't add up with the facts. However, as fate would have it, some new information surfaced that fills in this picture a little more. I discovered from a 1920s Who's Who in Kentucky article on Paul that he had, in fact, been in Paris the year after graduating high school. Only it was Paris, Kentucky, not Paris, France. Was this more than a coincidence? Yes, since we later confirmed that K.D. had also gone to Paris, Kentucky to study art. How could Paris, Kentucky have turned into Paris, France? David offers an answer from the pages of his own book. In writing about Brad Steiger, the author of Paul's biography, In My Soul I Am Free, where David has quoted these stories about Paul's youth, David wrote, Steiger himself admits to having changed the real names and places in Twitchell's biography, which he adds is a common practice in the biographies of famous people. So where does this leave us? What does all this mean? None of these details about Paul's birth and childhood are central to the spiritual teachings of Eckankar. In fact, they are quite irrelevant. If they impact anything, they alter what we might call the mythology of Paul Twitchell, meaning the images of Paul that he created for himself, or that we have created of him? David Lane replies, I find this section here by Doug to be a whitewash, primarily because Paul himself doesn't infer Paris, Kentucky at all, but rather Paris, France. Indeed, Doug would have us believe, given his quote above from me about Steiger, that Steiger was perhaps adding details, etc., that weren't there. But this is not what Paul Twitchell himself said. Just go read page 38 onward of Difficulties of Becoming the Living Eckmaster, tape-recorded and transcribed talks of Paul Twitchell, wherein he writes the following about Paris. Well, in living in Paris, I was quite happy at the time when I was over there with my sister, my stepsister, Katie, page 39. We were just a few blocks away from Montmartre, where all the famous artists were living. At that time, there weren't any great artists living that I know of there. Edgar Degas was the last that I knew of, and Katie was very close to him because she was studying under one of his students. Paul Twitchell isn't talking about Kentucky. He's talking about France. Steiger isn't to blame. Paul Twitchell is the one who claims it was Paris, France. Why doesn't Doug acknowledge this? Why whitewash it? We have Paul's own words, and it looks clearly to be a lie. If Paul didn't go to Paris, France, then why should we believe that he went to Allahabad, India, around the same time? It doesn't make any sense. And that is the point that Doug is whitewashing here. If Paul didn't really go to Paris, France, then there is no reason to believe that he ever met Sudhir Singh in India either. Doug sees this vital biographical information as irrelevant. His own words. But quite the contrary. They are vitally relevant, since they speak to the very heart of Paul Twitchell's honesty in revealing his biography and his travels. Why lie about it? Mythology 101? Doug Marmon writes, As we grow and learn more about others, we continually adjust how we see our friends, our parents, and even our wife or husband. This is natural. Sometimes these changes come from things we learn about ourselves as well. Therefore, new information that alters our images of Paul should not of itself cause significant problems. But according to David, it is a major problem. According to David, these are core issues, and they are central to believing anything Paul has said or written. David put it this way to me in an internet post on April 16, 1997. I think it is foolish to trust Mandalic, spiritually symbolic, statements when the guru is dishonest about empirical, factual statements, and we know Twitchell twisted facts. In other words, how can you believe anything Paul teaches about the spiritual path once you know he has lied about something like his childhood? There is a fascinating paradox in this matter that is not immediately obvious, but is extremely important. To illustrate this, let me start off with a few observations. There was another facet of Paul's childhood that only got a moment's mention in David's book, even though it did not agree with the facts any more than other stories Paul told. Paul said that the name of his hometown was China Point, when it was in fact Paducah, Kentucky. There is one big difference with this lie, as David would call it, and the other stories that Paul told. The difference is that China Point was something that Paul had been asked about while he was still alive. I don't know how it got started, but most Eckists that I remember in the early days seemed to know that China Point wasn't the real name of his hometown. Someone had once asked Paul why he used a made-up name for his birthplace, and he had answered something along the lines that he didn't want to bother any family members or townsfolk with any intrusions into their lives. At least that's how I heard it. So although I never knew that Paul's real hometown was Paducah, I wasn't at all surprised that it wasn't China Point. In other words, there was no great surprise nor feeling of being lied to later on when we found out the truth. Why? Simply because Paul had explained his intentions before he died. The shock value and the negative reaction were not there because Paul had explained his creative constructions. But why should our experiences be so different with these other stories of Paul's when the facts are so similar? David Lane replies, well, again, I think Doug is engaging in a theological whitewash because it does clearly matter to people if Paul was being misleading about his travels to Paris, France, and to India at a young date. While it may not matter to Doug, it certainly does matter to others, and I see no reason why Paul couldn't simply have told the truth about his early biography. Doug calls them creative constructions. Okay, but that sounds like a sophisticated euphemism for not stating the obvious. Paul lied about his early travels. Did he go to Paris, France, or not? Did he go to India or not? I don't think it is the reader's fault when the author misleads him or her. Creative constructions or opportunistic lying. Therein lies the rub. Doug Marmon writes, what if Paul, before he died, had been asked publicly about if he changed his date of birth? And what if he had answered, well, first, I'm a private man. Also, I like having fun with people that use the outer facts of my life to fit me into some kind of box. I don't live in their boxes, you see, and I decided when I was a boy that I would define my age from the inside out, not from the outside in. After I first posted this chapter to the internet, I ran across a quote that fits too perfectly to be left out. It comes from a 1976 World News interview with Dick Braun, a friend and associate of Paul's from 1959 to 1961. Dick told some fascinating stories about Paul's psychic abilities, which he saw for himself in those days. Dick also said, I was constantly after him, Paul, as to how old he was, and he said he was not really of this particular world. And I said, well, what do you mean, world? Now we have to define world, and how old are you? He said he was 23,000 years old, and he was a Thetan, and he said that he had come from outside of our solar system, but in the physical universe. But you see, at this particular time, I didn't understand what he was talking about, because I didn't understand the 3 levels of the negative world, and he kept talking about them. Of course, I'm going back 15 years. I didn't take notes on things like this. These were things, some of it, I would look at it with a jaundiced view, and I would look at it and say, yeah, you're 23,000 years old. And then I said, you really are 23,000 years old? Paul said, Richard, what difference does it make how old I am? It's what my spirit is, and spirit is eternal. Or, what if Paul had been asked if he had made up his story about being born out of wedlock and being trained by an Eck master in the art of soul travel as a teenager? And what if he had answered, I am trying to get people to see the inner reality. These stories are describing an inner truth. Don't get too concerned about the outward facts. As I've said many times before, I'm just a man like any other man. But the question is, did you understand the meaning of these stories? Did they call you and draw you on to search for more? If so, then they served their purpose. The point I'm trying to illustrate here is that when we are facing new facts without an explanation, people often imagine the worst. This is what exactly causes the feeling of shock when we learn the unexpected. It is from a fear that we have foolishly believed in something that isn't true, that we have been duped. But it is just this sort of negative imagination that really dupes us. David has suggested over the last 20 years that eckists are fools if they don't accept this negative imagination about Paul because it shows they aren't facing the facts. But these facts fail to support the accusations David has made. David Lane replies, "Once again, I think Doug is engaging in a theological whitewash. Lest anyone forget, Paul Twitchell is the one who said he went to Paris, France, and India at a young age, when it looks like he didn't do either of those things. Doug wants to invoke creative constructions as an explanation. That's fine, but it still doesn't get Paul Twitchell off the hook. The hook is this. Paul didn't go to either place, yet wanted to mislead his readers into thinking that he actually had physically. So it doesn't take a negative imagination to say, well, Paul wasn't honest about his biography. He wasn't. I don't see anything negative in it at all. Quite to the contrary, it actually allows one to accept the obvious. What is that? Twitchell made things up about his early life. His biography, especially as espoused in his own talks and In My Soul I Am Free, are not accurate, not even close to being accurate." Doug Marmon writes, "It is for this reason that journalists won't mix presumptions and guesses with facts when they are writing an exposé. The facts can be startling enough, and the readers are best left alone after being shocked to work through what it means by themselves. To insert strongly felt opinions after shocking the reader with new information, whether it is intentional or not, is a form of manipulation. If we are interested in spiritual truth, we must be mindful of our own subconscious reactions. We should look for a balanced state of mind before we try to understand the meaning of things that challenged our previous ways of seeing things. There is another important point to bring out here. As I mentioned before, David suggests that the facts about Paul's life should be used to judge the truth about Paul and his spiritual teaching. Or if Paul lied, then you should not trust anything else he has said. The Sufis call this the mistake of judging the contents by the container. There is a real danger in this, because it creates a false sense of knowing something that is not truly understood. To me, this is like using tea leaves and trying to see the present. If you can see the present by simply opening your eyes, then what need do you have of tea leaves? If you can sort the chaff from the wheat of spiritual truth by being able to see through direct spiritual perception, then why would you depend on some sort of mechanical formulas to make decisions about truth? In other words, either we can judge the truth of Paul's spiritual teachings or we cannot. Relying on other mechanisms is only an indication that we do not really know what spiritual truth is. The problem with the facts of people's outer lives is that they tell us almost nothing about the real person. But our modern era is an age of appearances. It is a time of great shallowness, when the masses are easily swayed by a few words, even if nothing in fact has really changed. The commentators on TV, in magazines, and newspapers actually score people's success by whether their popularity has gone up or down, as if this says anything important at all about these people. Public humiliation and stardom, the rise and fall, are seen as some sort of sport for the masses. Therefore, the paradox here is that David is suggesting these facts of Paul's life, his stories and his alterations, you might say, somehow define who Paul Twitchell was. This is the ultimate irony, because from what I know of Paul, if anything, these stories show a man refusing to be defined by the events of his life. Paul has always struck me as a man perfectly at ease with creating who he was, and not at all dependent upon social acceptance or established norms. It is a part of his whole philosophy." David Lane replies, "Well, again, I think Doug is trying to legitimize, perhaps with spiritually good intentions, why Paul's recollections of his life don't seem to tally with the facts as we have discovered them. While I certainly agree with Doug that a man cannot be wholly judged by the lies he tells, I do think it is important to stop and consider why a spiritual leader would make up things about his life that are empirically untrue. At the very least, it is a caveat for the seeker or the reader to be on the guard. As the cliché says, buyer beware. Doug Marmon writes, but rather than listening to what David or I have to say about Paul, why not read what Paul had to say about himself? The following is a quote from an article by him called The Square Peg, which he wrote in 1963. The cliffhanger is a one-man cult. I am the original cliffhanger and its sole disciple. The name was coined to explain my attitude regarding this age of mass culture as a lot of abracadabra. The name is synonymous of a man hanging on the edge of a cliff, safe from the crowd, more outside than the outsider, happier than the angry young men, and at the opposite pole from the existentialist who claims man has no hope in life. The ways of this kooky civilization has left the cliffhanger with no alternative than to turn his back on our homogeneous society and go his way with those who might have been called cliffhangers, i.e., Byron, Tom Paine, Rimbaud, Lawrence of Arabia, and others who have earned the various tags of nonconformist, individualist, rebel, and lonely oddballs. The cliffhanger is not interested in public bangles, nor willing to give himself the airs of a hero by proclaiming a great love to raise money for hospitals or worthy causes which involve the enthusiasm of the middle class. Neither is there anything else in this mass age great enough to make him climb a wall, especially in religion. History is made by the impact of the eccentrics, the originals, the proud, imaginative people from which new ideas come. A society cannot get along without its cliffhangers, because they are the most vivid means of exhibiting the power of free men. For this reason, this Bobby Dazzler feels the break is necessary with our mass culture, because it has considered the man of imagination and free spirit dangerous. He generally makes his living in one of the aesthetic arts, has his own lingo for communication, and has earned the label of illogic in philosophy and deed. He has rejected the great unwashed who are up to their ears in this department store culture of pension plans, telephones, radio and TV, dogma, and money changers. Accordingly, he sees this civilization heading down the path to destruction and will be the greatest to suffer unless he can get out of it quickly. But he is in a sense like Thoreau, who wasn't in the least interested in changing the ways of his time, but wants to be left alone to enjoy his own company and solitude. My writings are pointed towards this, although they may appear on the surface like the works of a man careless of law and landlords with the attitudes of gay mockery. The cliffhanger may be the favorite of the gods, and it's certain he is the lonely hero of these times. But as I have said, it is a one-man cult, with myself as founder, president, and disciple. On the other hand, perhaps through Paul's own words he did explain himself before he died. Perhaps through his own words we get a clearer picture than the creations of our fearful imagination. And perhaps the only shock for us is that Paul was more creative in his own life than we thought, more interested in privacy than we realized, and less concerned about social conventions. David Lane replies, Okay, so it can also mean that whatever Paul said about his life may not be true or accurate. I don't see why the reader is at fault because the author isn't straight about his life. former chela, recalls Paul Twitchell and his plagiarism. Now, as I look back, I see that Paul Twitchell got caught up in his own story, fabrications and all, and had the misfortune of believing it. The power and lure of adoration and worship may have been too intoxicating. There wasn't anyone around at the time that would call him on it, though the closest person to doing this was Dr. Bluth. He was like a kind, benevolent father figure. There were several occasions where he would try to steer Paul from certain actions. I was also present at a meeting between Chet Tuttle and Dr. Bluth where they discussed concerns with the direction Paul was going. And if my memory serves me, I recall this was around the whole Mahanta title and its implications and with the publishing of The Far Country and its probable source. To the best of my recollection, Paul was not a good manager of money, and from my experience he really did not want to put his time and energy into this aspect of the operations. To this end, he hired Chet Tuttle, who replaced John Nero in charge of the operations office in Las Vegas. Chet was responsible for taking the business end of things from deep in the red to the black. He gave Chet free rein in the administrative side of things. However, this came to an end when Gale and Darwin came into the picture following Paul's death. If I recall correctly, Chet Tuttle and Gale met shortly after Paul's death to select a new master. Chet was very unhappy with the selection of Darwin. Gale was the kingmaker. I knew Darwin before he became master, and he always struck me as being somewhat frail, unsure of himself, and not very grounded in the everyday world. Looking back, I do not believe I was very grounded either, so had a leg up in recognizing the symptoms. Darwin was a good choice for Gale, as it provided her a solid means to stay in control of the operation. In the end, it is my belief that Gale benefited the most from this whole fiasco. I left the organization at the same time that Chet Tuttle was fired. I was not asked to leave. I left on principle. I wrote a letter to the board of directors explaining in detail what I had become aware of. However, this did not result in anything but being blackballed by the organization. There was, and probably still is, a myth that you dissolve spiritually if you leave the organization. If there is one message I have to impart, it is that this is not the case. This was just the jumping-off point of my continued spiritual path, and I believe that I am stronger for it. It was always my suspicion that Chet fancied himself the next master. However, I was present at a meeting where Paul told Chet that he would not be asking him to be the next master, but that he wanted him to stay on as administrator. This was during Paul's last business meeting in Las Vegas, a few months prior to his death. So I believe he knew it was coming. There was always a suspicion that Paul had a list of potential candidates for master, and he did allude to some mumbo-jumbo about who and when. But Chet advised that there was no list as such, though apparently there were a few names scribbled down with no title or reference. He apparently reviewed these with Gale at their meeting following Paul's death. As I stated, Darwin was Gale's doing. I was one of the people that toured Darwin around the office, reviewed materials and processes with him, and later went to dinner with him. I was not supposed to know what was happening, his initiation, and that he was going to be announced as master, but of course I did, and at dinner he advised me himself. He was frightened out of his mind. My words, my analysis. Just after The Far Country was published, Paul gave me a copy of The Path of the Masters to read. We had a follow-up discussion shortly after that, and he wanted to know what my comment was. I recall stating that I had found sections of it that were the same as what I had read in The Path of the Masters. His remark was essentially the same one that Dr. Bluth quotes in the attached excerpt. I was very disturbed by this and advised Chet Tuttle of this conversation. This resulted in Chet and I going to see Dr. Bluth to discuss our concerns. If I recall, the decision was that Dr. Bluth would take this matter up with Paul. I was not aware of any outcome at the time, nor did I experience any repercussions from Paul, so not sure if he was aware of my involvement. To this day, I am perplexed why he even gave me the book and sought my feedback. I still have the book, and it was what eventually led me to pursue the teachings of Radhaswami. Dr. Bluth and the Path of the Masters. Excerpted from a letter by Dr. Louis Bluth, former president of Eckankar, one-time follower of Sawan Singh, and Paul Twitchell's personal doctor when the Ek leader died in 1971. Date, June 19, 1980. My wife and I opened the first Ek class in Sun City, California. I personally treated Paul Twitchell many times and was the main speaker in Cincinnati when he passed away. Paul was a sincere student in the beginning, and I considered him honest. Problems between him and his wife Gail led him to believe she was going to leave him, and he desperately wanted to keep her. So when she demanded more money and better living, he started to write things and copy from other books. He, Paul Twitchell, borrowed my books on Radhaswami and copied a large share from them. I helped him write the herb book and went to Riverside University and took Sanskrit, so basically much of the material is good because it is copied. I confronted him, Paul Twitchell, with what he had done, and his answer was, "Since the authors of the book said it better than I could, I copied it." The trouble is that he never gave anyone credit as to where he got it. As far as Darwin Gross is concerned, my opinion is that he is a fake as a master. I don't think that a master would divorce his wife and seek many other female companions. Signed, Louis Bluth, M.D. Remembering Dr. Bluth and Ed Pekin. I don't exactly recall how I came into contact with Ed Pekin, who was a personal confidant of Paul Twitchell and his occasional bodyguard. However, Pekin was a treasure trove of information, and he eventually provided me with a slew of original documents relating to Eckankar, some of which had never been released to the public. I used to meet personally with Ed when he would visit Los Angeles. Invariably, our conversations would turn to Paul Twitchell and why he tried to hide so much of his past from his students. Pekin liked Twitchell, but he felt that Gail's influence on him had an adverse effect. Ed Pekin arranged for me to meet Dr. Bluth at a restaurant in Southern California. I had known prior that Dr. Bluth was a former initiate of Sawan Singh and had been on friendly terms with many early followers of Radhaswami Satsang Bays, including Dr. Stone, Mr. Wigglesworth, who also joined Eckankar, and Harvey Myers. Dr. Bluth met Charan Singh in 1964 when the Radhaswami guru made his first visit to the United States. I got the impression that Dr. Bluth had a falling out with Charan Singh during that trip. I recall how Dr. Bluth was driving with Charan in a car and how Charan had requested the driver to slow down. For some reason, this struck Dr. Bluth as odd. Doesn't the God-man control the known universe? Also, Dr. Bluth didn't agree with the strict vegetarian diet that was required in Radhaswami. And as Dr. Bluth himself admits in his June 18, 1980 letter, he was a ghostwriter for Paul Twitchell's Herbs book, wherein it is advocated to eat plenty of brains and livers for a healthy diet. Dr. Bluth also seemed to have diffident feelings towards Dr. Stone, professional rivalry, who he accused of being not wholly ethical or forthcoming about his personal life. Dr. Bluth informed me that he had shared his Radhaswami library with Paul Twitchell and was keenly aware of his plagiarisms. Dr. Bluth claims to have confronted Paul over it. Dr. Bluth was a harsh critic of Darwin Gross, who he felt wasn't a genuine master and had been set up in the lofty position of the living Eckmaster by Gail, whom Dr. Bluth accused of having engaged in an amorous affair shortly before Twitchell's untimely death in 1971. Even though Dr. Bluth became president of Eckankar for a short spell, he eventually cut asunder his former association with the movement. hypercriticism, and Yabal Sakabi. I think it is perfectly appropriate to test the extraordinary claims of masters, yogis, sages, mystics, and mahantas. What I find curious is that we are more hypercritical of those who document their challenges of these so-called gurus than we are of the very gurus themselves. It does not matter what tradition we are talking about, from Eckankar to Radhaswami to Advaita Vedanta to Disneyland. Anyone who makes claims of a trans-rational nature should be placed under very close scrutiny. Yet I find that we are more apt to kill the carrier of bad news. Twitchell didn't plagiarize, he just compiled. Twitchell didn't cover up, he just evolved and changed names. Darwin didn't steal money because Harold said so. Then inspect the message itself. Andy, a poster on alt.religion.eckankar, is right that there is more to the Darwin chapter than Eckankar tells us. And why is it that Darwin gets wasted by certain Eckists and Klemp, but Twitchell escapes the hook? What is fundamentally the difference between Twitchell and Gross? My sense is that Gross was delegitimized by the so-called legitimacy of Klemp. In other words, Gross gave up the symbols too early, and the symbols, namely trademark terms like Eckmaster, Mahanta, consciousness, and so on, came back to haunt him. If you want to say that Darwin did some reprehensible things, then tell us exactly what they were. And how do you know that Twitchell didn't do almost exactly the same? And how do we know that Harold Klemp, in his own way, has not Xeroxed Gross? What we are noticing here, of course, are frames of criticism. Because the leader has criticized someone, the followers then more or less follow suit. Darwin is bad. But when the current leader does not criticize the founder, the followers also more or less refrain from criticizing him. Twitchell was creative. Well, maybe we should help Darwin's image, just as we have been trying to re-image Twitchell. Below are some of my ironic revisions of Eckankar's claims against Darwin. Eckankar claim: Darwin stole money, millions of it. Spin doctor. Darwin borrowed money for the good of the corp. Eckankar claim: Darwin sexually hassled women in the office and elsewhere. Spin doctor. Darwin was trying to groom his chelas auras. Eckankar claim: Darwin did not show respect to the living Eckmaster. Spin doctor. Darwin thought he was still the Mahanta, though temporarily in retirement. He was having back problems, and the medications made him a bit irritable. It's tough being God-enlightened and having back problems. Where's the Doan's pills when you need them? Eckankar claim: Darwin was caught by the negative force and is no longer a member of Eckankar. Spin doctor. Just because Darwin took a couple of million and hid it in a dummy corporation does not mean that he was working with the Kaal. He was just trying to get higher interest rates and was going to return the money, plus extra, later on. Generally, I find that we don't spin doctor for Darwin Gross, yet we spin doctor for Twitchell and for Klemp and for almost any guru. The tendency to do such may be related, in mathematical terms, with the percentage of our day-to-day involvement with the guru in question. I think it is good to bash writers and undergraduate term papers and the like. But I also think we should really deeply question the ways in which we condone plagiarism, cover-up, tax fraud, lying, and the rest. To be sure, nobody comes out unscathed. But I do think that those who make the extraordinary claims deserve our very best extraordinary analysis. If we are willing to rip and shred critical studies of our respective gurus, then we should go the extra mile and do the same to those who are providing us with amazing promises. In other words, we're probably more critical of the 7-Eleven clerk than we are of the God-realized masters. To be sure, I want the big gulp machine cleaned once in a while, But I do think that guy who claims to have access to the very highest plane of consciousness deserves to be critiqued on why he can't write original sentences or be straight about his resume. I mean, the 7-Eleven guy would get booted for lying on his job application. When we find out that a God man did it, we say that he was just being inventive. Tell that to the 7-Eleven boss. He seems to have a higher standard on integrity than we do, and he sells candy. Plagiarist or master compiler. It has been over 40 years since I wrote The Making of a Spiritual Movement, the untold story of Paul Twitchell and Eckankar. In that rudimentary study, first written as a term paper when I was a 20-year-old undergraduate at California State University, Northridge, I focused on two contentious areas in the life and work of Paul Twitchell, the founder of Eckankar. One, Twitchell's apparent cover-up of his previous spiritual associations, where he replaced the names of real-life gurus such as Kirpal Singh and Swami Paramananda with mythological masters such as Sudar Singh and Rebazar Tars, which I later described as a form of genealogical dissociation. And two, Twitchell's alleged plagiarism of previously published books by Julian P. Johnson and others without attribution. In both cases, I provided a series of documented examples to underline these points. Today, it is generally accepted even by staunch Eckists that Paul Twitchell did indeed change the names of his previous teachers after he formally founded Eckankar. Why he did so, however, is still open to lively debates among both believers and skeptics. With regard to Twitchell's alleged literary borrowing, even the present living Eckmaster Harold Klemp admits that Paul Twitchell was a master compiler and did indeed employ varying spiritual sources for his books and articles. But even with this acknowledgement, there is still a very heated debate in Eckankar circles over how extensive Twitchell's plagiarism actually was and what it ultimately signifies. For instance, on the internet newsgroup alt.religion.eckankar, a few prominent posters have long contended that even if Paul Twitchell's plagiarism is conceded, it only represents 1 to 2% of his total output. Therefore, the plagiarism issue, which has been repeatedly cited by Eckankar critics to illustrate Paul Twitchell's deceptive character over the years, is exaggerated and overblown. In this section, we will tackle one key aspect of the plagiarism question that has haunted Eckankar almost from its inception. How extensive was Paul Twitchell's plagiarism? It is more or less an empirical question, and one which, I believe, can be answered to some measure, even if we may have debates about what it all means for followers or critics of Eckankar. It is a formidable task, and I have been resistant in taking on this project because I knew it would consume much of my intellectual time, which has over the years been devoted to a study of physics, evolution, and neuroscience. However, I have a certain fondness for Paul Twitchell and what he attempted to achieve, and I think that the time is ripe for a new analysis of his body of work. To accomplish at least part of this ambitious goal, I decided to start small and begin with one book which I sense contains the most plagiarized material. That Eckankar book is Paul Twitchell's The Far Country, which was published during his lifetime. In the 1978 version of my term paper on Eckankar, I noted that there were over 400 paragraphs that were appropriated from the books of Julian P. Johnson, an initiate of Sawan Singh, and a famous author of 4 Radhaswami Satsang Bey's publications during the 1930s. Some Eckankar followers have argued that I have inflated my claims about Twitchell's plagiarism, and that only listing the number of paragraphs that have been lifted from other publications is insufficient in trying to prove my case. While I think anyone can discover Twitchell's plagiarism for themselves, it is a very time-consuming exercise, and I can well understand why some of my critics would want me to shore up my proofs for easier access. In this study, I am only focusing on Twitchell's borrowing from the books of Julian Johnson, specifically With a Great Master in India, 1934, and The Path of the Masters, 1939, both published decades before Paul Twitchell first published his Eckankar books. Now, it seems fairly obvious to me that Paul Twitchell also appropriated the work of other authors in his book, The Far Country. However, what may be obvious to me may not be to others. Thus, I think another study in a future date should focus on other sources from which Twitchell may have drawn some of his writings. A note on methodology. When using Julian Johnson's two books for the basis of this study, it is important to note that both works have been reissued in several editions and numerous printings. Therefore, I felt it was important to have the earliest editions, or at least ones most likely to have been accessible to Paul Twitchell during his lifetime, as well as later editions that are readily available to audiences today for comparative analysis. Since many readers may not be able to get access to the first editions of With a Great Master in India, 1,000 copies were printed in India by the Sawan Service League, and The Path of the Master, which only had 200 beautifully bound copies printed in France in 1939. While the differences in varying editions is slight, I did notice that the spelling of certain Indian words in the earliest edition of The Path of the Masters was different than in later printings. For example, later editions of the book spell the Hindi word for true lord as Sant Purush, whereas the earliest edition have it spelled as Sat Purusha, retaining the ending A. Interestingly, Twitchell retains the latter spelling and not the former in his book, The Far Country, which, if we accept that he plagiarized from Johnson, indicates that he used an early edition of The Path of the Masters. It is also important to note in passing here that the former president of Eckankar, Dr. Bluth, and an initiate along with Julian Johnson of the late Sawan Singh, alleged in a letter that he personally loaned some of his Radhaswami books to Paul Twitchell. In doing this study, I decided it would be easiest to focus on a single chapter at a time. Hence, the following comparisons are only concerned with Chapter 1 of The Far Country. Eventually, we should have detailed analysis of each chapter of Twitchell's now out-of-print tome. In addition, I have tended to only select those appropriations which I felt were extremely close to Johnson's original work. Indeed, so close that anyone, even without a trained eye, would readily see the similarities. Now I realize that some of the comparisons will be more obvious than others, and some may object that I left other good examples of plagiarism out of this study which should have been included. I admit that I have not included all of the similarities I have found, but that was primarily because I wanted to only include those cases which I felt were almost self-evident. In any case, I welcome any further additions that other readers may find. In closing, I think even the most devout Eckankar follower will find something of value in this study. I have noticed that in reviewing Twitchell's work with new eyes, that I became fascinated by what he chose to include and exclude from Julian Johnson, and to ruminate over why he would leave some passages almost untouched, whereas in other instances he would do a fine-tuned reworking of some of Johnson's sentences. While for critics this study may only re-emphasize again Twitchell's habit of wholesale prevarication and his predisposition for literary dissociations, that is, the tendency to borrow from a work but not to acknowledge it, for others, including both skeptics and believers, it may provide a powerful glimpse into how and why he did so. You can get a free PDF which contains these 38 highly detailed and attributed examples from The Far Country, The Path of the Master, and With a Great Master in India on the website www.neuralsurfer.com in the audio section. Eckankar's official defense of plagiarism. With a wide background of study, you will find many similarities, both approximate and exact, in many religious statements, history, and mythology. Whether one is a student of Zoroaster, Mohammed, Buddha, Jesus, or Tao, many of the same things are said, and when translated in the same way. How did you know Johnson didn't obtain his information from Twitchell or Rebizar-Tars or some other common source? Don't be surprised that many people find the same truths, and even in the same words, commandments, etc., whether they are concepts, stories of events, or levels of God worlds or consciousness. Alan H. Nichols, attorney representing Eckankar, July 5, 1977. The plagiarism charge is a time-honored technique of the orthodox to undercut the authenticity of new streams of religious thought. Mary Baker Eddy of Christian Science, Ellen White of the Seventh-day Adventists, Joseph Smith of the Mormons, all have been attacked similarly, reflecting the orthodox mindset that a religion is only valid as its books and its archaeology. Eckankar is not a book-based path. Gary Hardiman, Eckankar International Headquarters, January 18, 1983. When God Responds. Darwin Gross versus David Lane. In December of 1993, Darwin Gross, former Eckmaster and spiritual successor of Paul Twitchell, the founder of Eckankar, sent out a communication trying to refute several of Lane's documented allegations. The following is Lane's point-by-point rebuttal. Sri Darwin Gross. It has come to my attention that David C. Lane, Ph.D., has revised his book about Paul Twitchell, the Corp, and myself. You might say bad-mouthing both Paul and Darwin. This article is an attempt to set straight some of the facts that I know for myself to be true about Paul Twitchell and the organization he started while he was here in the physical, and some of the charges that David Lane brought up in his book, The Making of a Spiritual Movement, about Paul, about the corporation that Paul started, and some false accusations about Paul Twitchell, including myself. Editor's note. Whenever Darwin mentions the Corp or corporation, he is referring to Eckankar. The reason Darwin calls it the Corp instead of simply saying Eckankar is because he has been involved in a legal dispute with Eckankar over copyrighted terms. Apparently, Darwin is worried that he might be sued if he mentions Eckankar by name. See When God Gets Dethroned, The Downfall of Darwin Gross, in the 1994 edition of The Making of a Spiritual Movement. Sri Darwin Gross. First of all, there is no denying that there are a few paragraphs in The Far Country that are similar to another book written by another spiritual author in Australia. Now, when one contemplates and goes to that temple within, that's going to the same well. That's something David Lane can't get into his head, let alone Mark Albrecht of the Spiritual Counterfeits and the Die-Hard Christians. David Lane. You claim that Paul Twitchell's book, The Far Country, contains a few paragraphs that are similar to another book written by another spiritual author in Australia. On both accounts, Darwin, you are wrong. First, at least one half of The Far Country was appropriated from the writings of Julian P. Johnson, author of 4 books on Sant Mat in the 1930s, including With a Great Master in India, Call of the East, The Unquenchable Flame, and The Path of the Masters. As for the other half of The Far Country, it appears that Twitchell copied from a host of other writers. I don't consider over 400 paragraphs to be a few. Second, Julian P. Johnson was not from Australia, as you erroneously claim. In fact, he was from Kentucky, the same state where Paul Twitchell was born. Third, you claim that Johnson and Twitchell went to the same well to get their information. Not only is your explanation a fairly lame attempt to condone plagiarism, but I can show you text by text, paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, how you are wrong. Johnson wrote in a distinctive style which reflected, for better or worse, his upbringing, his cultural values, his racism, his sexism, and the 1930s in which he was writing. Johnson also made a number of spelling and grammatical errors, which were only corrected in later editions in the 1970s and 1980s, long after Twitchell's own death. Now, Twitchell not only duplicates Johnson's seasoned and nuanced style, but he also copies verbatim his grammar and spelling mistakes. Moreover, when Johnson does quote other writers from other worldly sources, read not astrally deposited books, he properly cites them and their respective texts. When Twitchell plagiarized Johnson, he forgot to differentiate between Johnson's own writing and Johnson's quoted material. Thus, by this very simple blunder, Twitchell exposed the secret behind his writing. He was parroting what he had read from the Path of the Masters and with a great master in India. By the way, Darwin, I don't ask you to believe me. I simply ask that you read both books side by side and see for yourself. As you often say, seeing is believing. Twitchell was, to be sure, a notorious plagiarizer and purloiner of copyrighted material. To deny that fact, and it is a fact, is to simply display your own ignorance of copyright laws, something which you must be familiar with after your legal battles with the corporation, that is, Eckankar. Let me put it more bluntly. If one of my college students plagiarized just 1/10 of what Twitchell appropriated, he or she would not only receive an F in my class, he or she would be expelled from the college. Do you really want to have a higher moral standard for high school or college students and a lesser one for God-realized masters? Sidebar. I am convinced that Twitchell plagiarized a lot more than I suggest, which is, of course, bad enough. Remember that I have touched only the tip of the huge iceberg of literary piracy. Sri Darwin Gross. David Lane has made a statement that I asked the Chelas to destroy the SCP journals back in December 27, 1979. That is false and taken out of context. I could not find a record of this statement. At that period of time, I was in Holland and had been for 2 weeks. He'll have to produce that one. I don't have a copy of it, and I've never asked anyone to burn or destroy anyone else's writings. David Lane. Concerning the infamous December 27, 1979 document which you claim you have not seen and did not write, you must not have looked very hard, since I included a photocopy of the original in the 1983 version of The Making of a Spiritual Movement. For your convenience, I append a copy. As you will no doubt see, you did clearly ask for the SCP journals to be destroyed. Your claim that my statement is both false and taken out of context sounds like so much doublespeak to me. Better check with your secretary, Bernadine, since she, along with your memory, is the only one that you can blame now. Editor's note. The Spiritual Counterfeits Project in Berkeley, California, published an extensive critique of Eckankar's history and theology in 1979, largely based upon my 1977 and 1978 term papers for a religious studies class at California State University, Northridge. SCP's journal, Eckankar, A Hard Look at New Religion, was widely distributed. Sri Darwin Gross. Second, he called Paul a follower of the Radhaswami and initiated by Kirpal Singh. Both those charges are false. Had he read Paul's books and writings, he would have learned that Paul's mission was to study every cult, occult, and spiritual path on earth, to learn how they were made up, what they do, and that includes Scientology and all the churches. In fact, his mother took him to the Catholic Church when he was younger, and he studied all groups of teaching that had any significance whatsoever. I know for my own self, the corporation used to have a letter that Paul wrote to Kirpal Singh, A, telling him to leave him alone, B, that he never was initiated by Kirpal Singh, and C, he was never a student. Paul only sat in on a satsang to learn how Kirpal Singh did it. I know David Lane went over to India in an attempt to find out something about Paul, and he couldn't find anything. David Lane. Editor's notes. Darwin has his details wrong here. I actually said that Paul Twitchell was a follower of Ruhani satsang, as founded by Kirpal Singh, which is an offshoot from the Radhaswami satsang Bays branch. Also, if I may interject an autobiographical note to Darwin's incorrect categorical statement, I would like to mention that I have read every available book authored by Paul Twitchell. I say available precisely because some of his writings were distributed only to higher initiates in Eckankar. Perhaps to the chagrin of Darwin and Harold, I have also had the opportunity to read most of the secret material as well. You are wrong again in saying that I went to India and found nothing concerning Paul Twitchell's connection with Kirpal Singh. As I mentioned in the Delhi Connection, discovering Twitchell's initiation papers in my 1989 and 1994 versions of The Making of a Spiritual Movement, I was privy to all of the letters Kirpal Singh received from Paul Twitchell over a 10-year span. Not only did Twitchell receive initiation from Kirpal Singh in 1955, the initiation papers, by the way, are personally signed by Twitchell, but his wife, and yours, Gail, also received initiation in 1963. Her signature is also on record. In Twitchell's correspondence with Kirpal Singh, he addresses almost every letter with honorifics, such as Dear Beloved Master, Dear Beloved Guru, or My Holy Master, etc. There are tens of letters from 1955 to 1966 written by Paul Twitchell to Kirpal Singh, each filled with loving accolades to his guru. If you don't believe me, Darwin, then write to Rajinder Singh, Kirpal Singh's grandson, at Vijay Nagar, Delhi, India, since he now has control of the complete Twitchell/Kirpal Singh file. You claim, Darwin, that Paul only sat in on a satsang to learn how Kirpal Singh did it. Again, not only is your claim wholly inaccurate and misleading, but it contradicts Paul Twitchell's own writing on the subject. Twitchell himself has stated in print at least 20 different places that Kirpal Singh was his guru, the master who taught him Shabad Yoga. I am not the one making the claim about Twitchell's association with Kirpal Singh and Ruhani satsang. Your own teacher did. Moreover, we have numerous pictures, tape recordings, letters, documents, etc., which attest to Twitchell's study under Kirpal Singh. You are being deceptive when you say that Twitchell sat in a satsang. It was Twitchell who dedicated the original Tiger's Fang to Kirpal Singh. I have seen Twitchell's own personal letter to this effect. It was Twitchell who brought his second wife and yours to get initiated by Kirpal Singh in 1963. It was Twitchell who kept up a 10-year correspondence with the Delhi Guru. Sri Darwin Gross. Another fact, he was quoting that Paul changed Kirpal Singh's name to Sudar Singh. Some of the items of Paul's included a painting of Sudar Singh. It was nothing like Kirpal Singh or any of the Singhs associated with Radhaswami. It was an initiate of Paul's that did some editing for him in the Flute of God and was a former Radhaswami student. When he came to the name of Sudar Singh, he changed it to Kirpal Singh without checking with Paul. David Lane. I must confess, Darwin, that I am a bit surprised by your lack of ingenuity. If you want to defend your teacher, Paul Twitchell, there are no doubt many ways to do it. But to completely overlook the plethora of historical documents which unequivocally attest to Paul Twitchell's discipleship under Kirpal Singh is really not a very wise defense on your part. Why? Because all one has to do to refute your claim is to look at Paul's early writings before Eckankar was officially founded. In almost every one of his early articles, written for a wide variety of magazines ranging from Orion, to psychic observer to search. Paul mentions Kirpal Singh. Your excuse that some former Radhaswami student edited out Sudar Singh in the original version without Paul's permission contradicts not only Paul's early writings before he started Eckankar, but also his early advertisements for Eckankar, wherein he states that he was a follower of Kirpal Singh. Moreover, you have the story backwards. The name Sudar Singh does not appear in the original manuscript version of Letters to Gale. The name Kirpal Singh does. Why? Because Gale was also a fellow initiate of Kirpal Singh and was well aware of his life and work. It was only after Eckankar was successful that Twitchell commenced an international cover-up concerning his actual spiritual heritage. The idea that one would switch Sudar to Kirpal and then back to Sudar displays how illogical you can be, and also how completely misinformed you really are. Without intending to be patronizing, may I ask you a very pertinent question? Have you ever read my book, The Making of a Spiritual Movement? I seriously doubt it. You seem to have your information upside down. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't mind honest criticism, but your points are so convoluted and so completely non-factual that I can only wonder if indeed you have checked the documented evidence for yourself. I sense that you are relying on second-hand reports of what I say versus investigating the matter for yourself. I say all of this primarily because the original Flute of God appeared in installments for Orion magazine, not as an Eckankar book. It is in that more raw form that we find the name Kirpal Singh, Swami Premananda, etc. Furthermore, we also have tens of other name replacements which occur after Eckankar is started in 1965, including changing the original source of the Bible to the Shariat Ki Sugmad. What you fail to notice is that Sudar Singh's name does not appear in print until after 1964, whereas Kirpal Singh's name is mentioned repeatedly before and after that date. Additionally, there is no good reason for that Radhaswami student, I assume you're referring to Dr. Louis Bluth, who was initiated by Sawan Singh and eventually became the president of Eckankar, only to later disavow both you and Eckankar as frauds, to replace Sudar with Kirpal, since Kirpal Singh was viewed as an offshoot from Radhaswami and not regarded as a genuine master. Indeed, it was precisely because Twitchell was a disciple of Kirpal Singh that he utilized the phony name of Sudar to cover his tracks. By the way, Darwin, do you have an address for Sudar Singh in Allahabad? Do you have any of his writings? Do you have any of his books? Why is it that I have seen tens of letters by Paul Twitchell to Kirpal Singh, but not one authentic one to Sudar Singh? Why is it that nobody in the Shabad Yoga tradition has ever heard of such a Sudar Singh? Not to be confused with Sudarshan Singh, the nephew of Shiv Dayal Singh, who was associated with Swami Bhagd in Agra. Why is it that when Mark Juergensmeyer, J. Gordon Melton, Daniel Gold, W. H. MacLeod, Aaron Telsky, and a host of other Shabad Yoga scholars investigated the history of Sant Mat and Radhaswami, Sudar Singh's life and work did not come to light? I know why, and you should too. Sudar Singh, as such, does not exist. He was a cover name to hide Paul Twitchell's association with real-life gurus like Swami Premananda, Kirpal Singh, L. Ron Hubbard, and others. I can present overwhelming documentation to prove Twitchell's association with Kirpal Singh. Darwin, can you give me just one documented piece of evidence proving Twitchell's association with the so-called Sudar Singh? And please, do not tell me that a painting of Sudar Singh proves his existence. Darwin, You definitely have the right to defend Paul Twitchell, but I would prefer if you would engage in facts instead of misconstructions of imagined or wannabe history. Sri Darwin Gross. In putting together the corporation that Paul put together, an enormous amount of people misunderstood what he had written and spoken of from the platform. I don't recall who it was that did a study of Paul's writings in regards to this plagiarism statement, that they found less than 1% of all that he wrote to be similar to another's writings. They forgot the man, Paul Twitchell, had a photographic memory. He could read something and recite it or write it later word for word. Now, if you call that plagiarism, fine, but it's a fact. David Lane. You have succeeded, Darwin, in the course of 4 sentences to contradict yourself 4 times. Either Twitchell's writings are original, which you claim by citing that unknown author who studied Twitchell's writings and found less than 1% similarity, or they are not. You can't have it both ways. So why do you then proceed to mention Twitchell's photographic memory and his ability to recite quotations from books word for word? What does that have to do with Twitchell's so-called originality? The answer, of course, is nothing, except that you simply can't get the story straight, nor can you decide how to properly defend the literary transgressions of your mentor. You are simply wrong when you try to buttress your argument that Twitchell did not plagiarize by invoking some unknown study by some unknown author. I know why you cannot remember who did the study, because it was never done. And if, on the off chance that it was, I can assure you that its findings are completely mistaken. Twitchell is truly one of the greatest plagiarists of the 20th century. I don't say this lightly, and I'm not trying to overhype my case. There are not many successful authors who have copied whole books from other writers and gotten away with it. Twitchell thought he could because he was using rather obscure material. Julian Johnson's books were popular to a very select audience and not generally known to the reading public. Twitchell didn't just plagiarize from Johnson, he plagiarized from a variety of sources. It just happens that Johnson was his favorite author to crib from. By the way, all Twitchell had to do was properly cite and contextualize his material. I don't see why this is so hard to do. Grammar school kids are taught to reference materials. Why can't an Eckankar master do the same? Again, if you don't trust my seasoned observations on this plagiarism issue, then I suggest that you do your own cross-referencing. I guarantee you that your opinion will change if you really study how Twitchell copied profusely from other authors. Sri Darwin Gross. Another fact. Paul never tried to cover up his actual spiritual heritage. This is another story by David Lane, that Paul tried to cover up his spiritual heritage. You see, I have met those great teachers that Paul wrote about and spoke of. I have met them all. Each one of the individuals, such as Gopal Das, off the astral plane, with his golden hair, a beautiful soul. Banjiani, out in the Gobi Desert, very much alive. Then on up, clear up to the soul plane. Every master, on every level or dimension, I have met, and other too many dimension. Fubby Quants appeared to me when I started out studying Paul's writings. It's a beautiful experience filled with divine love. I'll never forget it. Rebizartars appeared to me and a host of other individual masters of his teachings that Paul brought forth to this world, which started in 1965 and still coming out and being perpetuated by myself under a different name called The Ancient Teachings of the Masters. It engulfs all of mankind's teachings, whether David Lane or some other diehard Christian, TV preacher, or what have you tries to rebuke it. David Lane. I am happy you have seen Fubby, Rebizar, and Banjani in your dreams' visions. However, Just because you have seen such individuals in your meditations or dreams does not mean that they actually exist as historical characters. As you know, thousands of people from around the world have all sorts of visions, many of which occur when they undergo a near-death experience. We have heard reports of individuals seeing Jesus, Guru Nanak, and Krishna. But such reported visions do not necessarily confer ontological status to such beings. Rather, they simply reflect the cultural and religious interplay of information available to individuals at any one given time. As such, then, visions tell us more about what one has been taught or indoctrinated into than about the relative historicity or facticity of divine beings. Keep in mind that thousands of people see visions of non-historical beings, individuals who do not exist in actual fact, but are rather the outcome of a skewed combination of imaginations, desire, fact, and fiction. Remember, people also see Elvis, Bart Simpson, and even flour tortillas in the afterlife. I'm not jesting on this last point, since a friend reported to me that an Indian woman had claimed to have seen a radiant, beautiful chapati, a whole wheat flour tortilla, in the middle of a tunnel of light. She claimed it was a truly exquisite piece of bread with a wonderful halo around it. Thus, just because you claim, Darwin, to have seen Gopal Das with his golden hair does not mean by extension or logic or circumstance that he does, in fact, exist. For that matter, we have all seen many things in our dreams which do not have an existence outside of our own perceptions. We should not confuse reported visions with so-called proofs of their empirical status. Twitchell literally created a galaxy of Eck names in order to deceive his followers from his real and imagined past. He also came up with such comical-sounding names to give the would-be Eckist a sense of mystery and antiquity about their newly discovered religion. The trouble with all of this, of course, is that Twitchell was creating a mythology which intertwined but did not distinguish fact from fiction, imagination from reality. For your benefit, Darwin, I enclose a section from my forthcoming book, Exposing Cults, When the Skeptical Mind Confronts the Mystical, New York and London, Garland Publishing, Inc., August 1994, which explains in some detail about how we should be skeptical of our own religious visions. By the way, it was fun communicating with you, and I invite you to write back with any further comments, suggestions, or criticisms. I only ask that you do one thing beforehand. Do some research. The Delhi Connection. Discovering Twitchell's Initiation Papers. In March of 1988, I was invited by Sant Darshan Singh, the son and chief spiritual successor of the late Kirpal Singh, to visit him and his wife at Sawan Kirpal Ashram in Vijay Nagar in Old Delhi, India. It was my 6th meeting with the venerable leader of one of the largest Surat Shabad yoga groups in the world. Darshan was a well-known Urdu mystic poet and had written a number of books on spirituality, including Spiritual Awakening and Secret of Secrets. Although I have had long talks with Darshan Singh before, ranging from 2 to 10 hours, I did not suspect that for the next 2 days we would spend close to 10 hours together discussing various aspects of Radhaswami and Satmat. What was most remarkable about this particular visit, though, was that Darshan had located Paul Twitchell's initiation records and other related correspondence. They had been lost for a number of years due to mismanagement on the part of Madam Hardevi and Thakar Singh, which clearly documented the founder of Eckankar's 10-year-plus association with Kirpal Singh and Ruhani Satsang. It was a rare opportunity for me, so I meticulously went over the file, which contained a number of affectionate letters by Paul Twitchell to his master, Kirpal Singh. Paul Twitchell was duly initiated in 1955 by Kirpal Singh, as had been known for some time. His experiences at initiation appeared to be significant. He heard the inner sound, saw light, and felt elevation. Indeed, Twitchell's subsequent correspondence with Kirpal Singh reveals that he had nightly excursions out of his body, apparently visiting higher astral regions and conversing with a number of spiritual masters, including Sawan Singh. Interestingly enough, however, Twitchell did not mention Rebazar Tars or Sudar Singh in any of his letters to Kirpal Singh, not even once. This is quite revealing, since Twitchell's letters span more than a decade, 1955 to 1966. From a close reading of the correspondence, it is obvious that Twitchell's inspiration for Eckankar came directly from his contact with Kirpal Singh and Ruhani Satsang. In fact, Twitchell even goes so far as to ask Kirpal Singh to publish his book, The Tiger's Fang, in 1966, well over a year after he founded Eckankar. Apparently, Twitchell's break from Kirpal Singh had more to do with economics than anything else. If Eckankar had not taken off as it did, attracting large numbers of Americans interested in astral travel and other esoteric matters willing to pay money for membership, books, and interviews, Twitchell most likely would have kept in friendly contact with Kirpal Singh. As it turned out, though, Kirpal Singh represented a significant threat to Twitchell's emerging empire, since, unlike Eckankar, Ruhani Satsang offered its teachings for free. In sum, Twitchell's decision to cover up his past association with Swami Premananda, Kirpal Singh, and others appears to be financially motivated. Another interesting piece of information that emerges from the file was Gail Atkinson's initiation record, which shows that she was initiated in 1963 and, like her husband Paul, apparently had good experiences at the time of initiation, hearing inner sound, seeing light, feeling bliss. I should add that these initiation papers, 1955 and 1963, were personally signed by Paul and Gail respectively. Twitchell's file also contains several pictures of him and Kirpal Singh together. These were taken in 1955 while Kirpal Singh was on his first tour of the United States. In 1955 alone, Twitchell had written 10 letters to Kirpal Singh, each one describing, albeit briefly, Twitchell's inner experiences in meditation. Concerning these experiences, a close reading of Twitchell's correspondence indicates that most of them occurred while he was asleep. That is, Twitchell's inner voyages are, for the most part, dream excursions, which may or may not have been consciously produced. One comes away with the impression that Paul's technique for inducing out-of-body experiences was to lie down and fall asleep, only to awaken minutes or hours later in a lucid, read astral, dream. It may have been precisely for this reason that Kirpal Singh dismissed many of Twitchell's inner experiences as inaccurate and incomplete. Kirpal Singh's responses were also revealing, since in none of the letters that I read did the Ruhani Satsang master reprimand Twitchell for his behavior. Rather, Kirpal Singh was tolerant of Twitchell's ways and always appeared interested in the work that he was doing. In one letter, Kirpal Singh even asked for Twitchell's help in getting one of his books published in America. What finally emerges from Twitchell's file is a portrait of a spiritual seeker turned economic opportunist. Instead of admitting to his weaknesses, like persistent lying and gross exaggeration, Paul instead tried to cover them up under the guise of being an enlightened being with a genuine spiritual master in the Vairagi tradition. Sadly, he was neither. Paul Twitchell plagiarizes Walter Russell. Research by Chuck Stockdale and David Lane. No one really knows the sheer extent of Twitchell's literary theft, although it's known to be extensive. He was a blatant plagiarist, and the stolen words often ended up in the mouths of his fictional Eck-masters. Just recently, 30 years after his death, even more plagiarisms are turning up. Shown here are some paragraphs, a small sampling, lifted from the works of Walter Russell and placed into his own book, The Tiger's Fang. What should cause us to pause a bit is that Twitchell and Eckankar claimed, and still do, that The Tiger's Fang was a true account of his inner journey to the Godhead. But it's certainly reasonable to question any and all Twitchell claims. If he did have such a journey, why the need to steal other authors' accounts of their personal journeys? Could it be, perhaps, that Twitchell never had the grandiose journeys he wanted his followers to believe? In the second chapter of The Tiger's Fang, Twitchell was found to have lifted over 50 paragraphs from the works of Walter Russell. A close look at the third chapter of The Tiger's Fang reveals still more plagiarisms of Russell's The Secret of Light, copyright 1947. He also appropriated from Russell's The Message of the Divine Iliad, Volume 1. Well over 50 paragraphs in the second chapter of Twitchell's The Tiger's Fang closely matched the distinctive philosophy and prose style of Walter Russell. Lest we think the universe has no sense of humor, it appears the master literary pirate tipped his hand. In an absolutely wonderful twist of irony, in his quote below, Twitchell ends up describing himself. Caveat emptor. Twitchell on the fakers who unethically steal the words and experiences of others. All philosophers, preachers, and sages who have the odor of philosophy, religion, and knowledge are not any of these. They are pretenders, those who pretend to have undergone the profound experiences of God, the faker drawing on experiences of real mystics, and the thieving of turns of speech and materials in the hope of conveying a conviction of genuineness. Paul Twitchell from The Tiger's Fang, page 51. You can obtain a free PDF which contains these further 57 highly detailed and attributed examples from The Tiger's Fang, The Secret of Light, and The Message of the Divine Iliad, Volume 1, on the website www.neuralsurfer.com in the audio section. Twitchell's plagiarism from Hazrat Inayat Khan's The Mysticism of Sound. Note: it may well be that Twitchell plagiarized this quote from an excerpt that he found in Julian P. Johnson's The Path of the Masters, which, ironically, was properly cited in the text. Twitchell, of course, gave no such citation, either to Khan or Johnson, making it appear that it was from his own pen. Flute of God, Chapter 6, as it appeared in Orion magazine, pages 43 and 44 by Paul Twitchell, and copyrighted in 1967. Compare with The Mysticism of Sound by Hazrat Inayat Khan, pages 64-65, original copyright date 1923. Paul Twitchell plagiarizes from Theosophy. Compare the Theosophical Glossary by H.P. Blavatsky, published in 1892, with Herbs, the Magic Healers by Paul Twitchell, published in 1971. Paul Twitchell plagiarizes Kirpal Singh. Compare pages 129 and 130 of Paul Twitchell's Stranger by the River, 1970, with page 67 of Kirpal Singh's Man, Know Thyself, first published in 1954 in The Way of the Saints. Paul Twitchell plagiarizes Lama Govinda. Lai Tzu versus Lama Ngawang Khalsang. Look closely at the following excerpts and see where Twitchell has reworked Govinda's passages. Excerpt from the Shirya Ki Sugmad, Book 1, Chapter 9, The Visions of Light Sea, by Paul Twitchell, 1970. An excerpt from The Way of the White Clouds, A Buddhist Pilgrim in Tibet, Chapter 2, The Guru's Vision, by Lama Anagorinka Govinda, 1966. Tomo Geshig, The Wondrous Ekmaster, versus Geshe, the Buddhist Rinpoche. In trying to track down the literary historical sources for Twitchell's Vairagi order, I was once sent an anonymous letter from a group of ex-Eckists in 1989 who hinted to me in a one-page letter that Chapter 9, The Visions of Lhasa, was primarily based, if not straight-out plagiarized in parts, from Lama Anagorinka Govinda's Chapter 2, The Guru's Vision, as found in The Way of the White Clouds. Naturally, my interest was piqued. After tracking down the book, I found to my chagrin that the Twitchell had plagiarized more widely than I had suspected. I invite anyone to research these two chapters for themselves to notice the striking similarities. However, a more curious development. In the same Chapter 9 of the Shirya Ki Sugmad, where Twitchell bases much of his writings and ideas on Govinda's text, he goes on to mention another Ekmaster, Tomo Geshig. Guess what? In Govinda's text, he writes in Chapter 2, The Guru's Vision, written 4 years prior, by the way, to Twitchell's account, of a Buddhist Lama by the name of, surprise, Tomo Gesh. Twitchell merely dropped the E and added the ig. Yet, typical with the Twitch, he neither cites nor references his sources. You can find these 12 examples in the free PDF on the website www.neuralsurfer.com in the audio section. New research by Chuck Stockdale. The following examples were taken from two books: Awakened Imagination by Neville, copyright 1954, and The Far Country by Paul Twitchell, copyright 1971. The Far Country has been taken out of print by Eckankar. The examples show first a passage from Neville's book, followed by the relevant sample from Twitchell's book. There are a couple of examples where Twitchell has copied Neville, who was quoting William Blake. This is also without reference to the original author. As I assembled these examples of blatant plagiarism, I was impressed with the degree of premeditation necessary to copy an author's work so extensively, especially using the sequence that the original author placed them in. It was evident that thoughtful deliberation was employed by Twitchell in this misrepresentation. All the following passages taken from The Far Country are alleged by Twitchell to be the words of a being called Rebazar Tars, who is supposedly speaking these words to Twitchell during his visits in his spiritual body to Rebazar's residence somewhere in the mountains of Tibet. In my mind, the fact that a great majority of these passages containing dialogue from this spurious being are in fact words of another writer causes serious doubt that this key figure in the Eckankar teachings ever existed except in the mind of Twitchell. David Lane has raised the valid point that if this being did in fact exist, Twitchell would have recorded his words rather than appropriating the words of another writer to put in the mouth of Rebazar Tars. Neville throughout his writings refers to the imagination as Jesus, which he claims is the real mystical intent of the writers of the Bible. Christ and Jesus, according to Neville, are synonymous with imagination or soul. It is interesting to note that Twitchell has taken what Neville has reported to be the free gift of God to man to advance him into physical and spiritual states, and modified and added to this, consequently portraying imagination to be primarily for spiritual pursuits. I quote the following from The Far Country. The only desire that man can rightfully have is a right and natural craving to enter into the state of consciousness which will allow him to enter into the far country. Page 225. By contrast, Neville wrote that all states, including all possible physical states and desires, are spiritual. He goes on to say that these states, including the physical, are designed by God, us, as themes of experience, and all are completely valid imaginal targets for our desired life experiences. We see Neville's much freer and less limited version that Twitchell has adapted the above paragraph from. Desire is the mainspring of the mental machinery. It is the blessed thing. It is a right and natural craving, which has a state of consciousness as its right and natural satisfaction. Page 52, Awakened Imagination. It is my opinion, having been a former member of Eckankar for 14 years, that this portrayal of imagination and other freely God-given elements as only being valid when used in spiritual applications is confusing and damaging to spiritual students. They see on the one hand that Rebazar Tars, a.k.a. Neville, is talking about using imagination to bring about any desired condition in life. And on the other hand, Twitchell keeps trying to swing it back around to the implication that it should only be used for spiritual gain. This is, in my estimation, a control implant by Twitchell to cause withdrawal from physical pursuits and let spiritual, Eckankar substance rush in to fill the vacuum created by this unnecessary and experientially harmful withdrawal. Twitchell successfully created in his writings an artificial division between spiritual and physical that can cause great inner conflict in the spiritual student, as it did for me some 15 years ago. I was very pleased to finally find the source of these words on imagination 15 years later, and to see that Neville, the original author, never imposed any of these illegitimate limitations on the use of imagination. On the contrary, he states in one of his books that the purpose of life is the creative realization of desire. This is a beautiful statement that implies the true freedom of God. The free PDF contains these further 39 fascinating and attributed examples from Awakened Imagination and the Far Country on the website www.neurosurfer.com in the audio section. Term Paper 101. Eckankar's lawsuit against Professor Ed Gruss and the Los Angeles Baptist College. Case number 276077. Filed in Los Angeles Superior Court in 1979. In 1983, in a book entitled The Making of a Spiritual Movement, The Untold Story of Paul Twitchell and Eckankar, Del Mar Press, I wrote in the preface the following concerning Eckankar's lawsuit against Professor Ed Gruss and the Los Angeles Baptist College. In 1979, Eckankar tried to take a $2.5 million lawsuit against Professor Ed Gruss of the Los Angeles Baptist College for allegedly publishing a highly defamatory term paper by James M. Peebles, a fellow classmate of mine at California State University, Northridge. Prompted by a letter to their office, Eckankar sent one of their own officials, Mike No, down to Southern California to secure a copy of the 12-page report, which claimed, among other things, that Eckankar was skirting tax laws and that Darwin Gross had fathered an illegitimate child. Mike No, as it turns out, though, asked for the paper from Ed Gruss under the false disguise that he was a member of the Spiritual Counterfeits Project, a conservative Christian research ministry centered in Berkeley. Gruss, who had not read the work, kindly gave No a photocopy. No went back to Menlo Park, and Eckankar then proceeded to take a lawsuit against Gruss for publishing the report. Though the lawsuit never did come to trial, Eckankar used it as the basis for several half-page advertisements in which they claimed that their group and its teachings were being attacked by conservative Christians. These advertisements were run in some of the major newspapers across the country, including the Los Angeles Times. Page XVI of the 1993 edition. Recently, on a news group called alt.religion.eckankar, several posters questioned whether such a lawsuit was ever filed against Eckankar. As a poster who goes under the name of Michael writes, "Why does David continually refuse to provide this info? It looks more and more like it is a sham. Just like the apparent friendship with Jim Peebles now looks much more like a mutual acquaintance, so too the lawsuit is looking querulous." Message 84 of 162, thread, The Peebles Puzzle, dated January 26, 2001. Since I do not have access to my files in Del Mar, relocated presently in Seal Beach, I responded to these many posts indicating that those concerned should contact Professor Ed Gruss or L.A. Baptist College, now known as Masters College, or Eckankar directly. I soon realized that this was most likely not going to happen, so I decided to contact Professor Gruss and the college directly. I did so today, Friday, January 26, 2001. This is how I went about doing so. I did an internet search for L.A. Baptist College and quickly learned that the school had evolved into Masters College. I eventually contacted Academic Affairs and explained my situation. I wanted to know what records they had concerning Eckankar's lawsuit against them in 1979. They took down my email and phone number. This afternoon, I received a phone call from Professor Ed Gruss, who no longer teaches at the college. Since I was not home, I called him back early this evening. We had a very pleasant conversation, and he was quite open and willing to explain how he was sued by Eckankar back in 1979. He has even kept a file of important documents from that time which helped him remember vital details. What follows are notes taken from that phone conversation. I made certain to jot down certain replicable bits of information, including the case number, so that others may find the pertinent information in the public record. I have cataloged Gruss's responses and my notes of them under a series of key questions to make it easier to read. How did Professor Gruss get Peebles' paper? Interestingly, James Marvin Peebles never gave a copy of his term paper to Professor Ed Gruss. Rather, it turns out that James Peebles had given a box of Eckankar materials, which included his term paper, to a pastor named Can Guidon at a Van Nuys Baptist church. When Pastor Guidon decided to go on a missionary trip, he handed over the box of Eckankar materials to Professor Ed Gruss. At this point, Ed Gruss had never heard of Jim Peebles. Sidebar: David Lane attended a service with James Peebles at this same Baptist church in Van Nuys. Peebles was a Baptist before he came to Eckankar. How did Eckankar find out that Gruss had a copy of Peebles' paper? Later on, Professor Gruss received an inquiry about Eckankar from a concerned parishioner. Apparently, someone in the Baptist faith was interested in the subject. At the time, Gruss then went through the materials and noticed a term paper on the subject written by James Peebles at CSUN. He then forwarded his only copy of that paper. At this time, he did not copy the text to this person, who in turn handed it to the seeker who, in turn, forwarded it to Eckankar headquarters. Then in early January 1979, Mike Noe, a member of Eckankar, went personally to see Professor Ed Gruss at L.A. Baptist College. Gruss says that he talked with Mike Noe at the break between his classes. Mike Noe represented himself as affiliated with the Spiritual Counterfeits Project. Mike Noe did not say he was a member of Eckankar. On this point, Ed Gruss was certain. Mike Noe asked Professor Gruss if he could see a copy of James Marvin Peebles' paper. Professor Gruss said he did not have a copy with him, as his only copy was with the concerned parishioner. He then told Mike Noe that he would mail him a Xerox copy of Peebles' report when he got it back if Noe covered his Xerox and mailing costs, apparently $2. After getting his only copy of Peebles' paper back, Ed Gruss then Xeroxed a copy of the paper and sent it to Mike Noe. Shortly thereafter, Eckankar sued Ed Gruss for $2.5 million. Gruss also remembered the figure as $2.5 million. Eckankar also sued L.A. Baptist College around the same time. On what basis did Eckankar sue Ed Gruss? Professor Gruss read to me over the phone the basis of Eckankar's lawsuit against him. Gruss was sued for publishing one Xerox copy mailed to Mike Noe, who requested it personally from Ed Gruss at LA Baptist College, an allegedly defamatory term paper by James Marvin Peebles. Darwin Gross, in a written statement, claims that Eckankar lost significant contributions to their monetary fund because of Peebles's paper. Sidebar. Darwin's claim is an intriguing one, since Peebles's paper had only been read by very few people. Apparently, Darwin felt that the allegations had piggybacked in other more widely distributed papers, including Lane's, which Darwin mentions by name in his last letter to Professor Gruss on July 21, 1980. The two defamatory allegations were that Darwin Gross had reported to have fathered an illegitimate child, and that Eckankar did not have religious tax exemption from the IRS. Both allegations, according to Gruss, were told to Peebles by members of Eckankar. Apparently, Gruss and Peebles have only communicated once, and that was on the telephone on March 15, 1979. In that conversation, Peebles informed Gruss that he included the information about Darwin Gross because he had been told such by higher-ups in the Eckankar organization. How was the lawsuit settled? Professor Ed Gruss was legally represented by Bill Thompson, who later convinced State Farm Insurance to represent him in his defense against Eckankar. Apparently, the case was settled with prejudice, which in this case means that Gruss cannot be sued again by Eckankar over this issue. LA Baptist College also settled with Eckankar since they had different legal representation. New details about Peebles' infamous paper. It turns out that the term paper, Eckankar, The Ancient Secrets of Soul Travel, James Peebles submitted to Professor Howard Happ, CSUN, American Sects and Cults, spring 1977, was not accepted for a passing grade. Peebles was advised to revise the paper in the summer to receive credit. Peebles did this over the summer, finally turning in an expanded report from 12 pages to 24, which includes a bibliography. It is this revised paper which eventually got into the possession of Professor Gruss. Was Gruss intending on writing on Eckankar? Professor Gruss told me tonight that he didn't know anything about Eckankar. He also mentioned that he had never written about them nor had any intention of ever writing about them. His area of expertise had been the Jehovah's Witnesses. Gruss was shocked by the lawsuit and that Eckankar never tried to contact him to reconcile their differences. It was a very trying time for him, he recalled, because not only was he sued, but his college was as well. Gruss also told me of the financial burden and stress it caused, since his yearly salary at the time was barely $10,000. When was the case settled? The case was settled in the spring of 1980. Darwin Gross, under the title Shri Darwin Gross, wrote a personal letter to Professor Ed Gruss on July 21, 1980. In that very letter, Darwin Gross mentioned David Lane's term paper and its influence. Raw documents on Eckankar history. I have been fortunate to have received a plethora of important documents, letters, and articles relating to Paul Twitchell's checkered biography and the history of Eckankar. Although some of the important pieces are not in pristine condition, they are nevertheless vital elements in helping us to better understand the evolution of this New Age religion from its earliest days. You can obtain a free PDF which contains copies of these documents, including photographs, legal, professional, and personal letters, newsletters, newspaper clippings, magazine articles, census data, death certificates, records of marriage, legal agreements, and even a page from Ripley's Believe It or Not on the website www.neuralsurfer.com in the audio section. This has been Gakko Came from Venus, Exploring the Lost History of Eckankar. Written by David Christopher Lane. Narrated by F.C. LaPlante. Copyright 2020 by David Christopher Lane. Production copyright by David Christopher Lane.